Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AEI. My name is Aparna Mathur, and I'm co-director of the AEI-Brookings Working Group on Paid Family and Medical Leave, along with Isabel Sawhill. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the release of the second AEI-Brookings Working Group report on paid leave. The working group is a unique combination of extremely distinguished individuals, you can see their names here, who are strong and independent thinkers, as Belle and I discovered over the course of the previous year. People who are able to disagree with each other, but do it in a respectful way, and people who can push our thinking in new and innovative directions. And this year has been one where we have all put in a ton of hard work, had many more working group meetings than we had initially anticipated, done multiple rounds of edits and reviews, and discussed points over and over again. So I'm really pleased to finally have a published, polished report ready for you. I'm extremely excited to present the report to you today. I hope you all have copies on the table. Otherwise, you can also get some copies outside. And I want to thank all our working group members, all the outside experts that we consulted, all of you who have continued to engage on this very important issue for working families. I also want to thank our research assistants, Cody, Eleanor, Erin, Christopher, without of whom putting all of this together would have been absolutely impossible. So I'm going to begin with a few brief remarks about where we were at the beginning of the year and our major sort of, what the landscape for paid family and medical leave looked like when we began, and where we are today. And then Belle is going to talk a little bit about where we came out with the report's findings. So at the end of, in June of last year, we released our report on paid parental leave. And since then, we've seen a few new legislative bills come out in Congress talking about new ways to do paid leave, whether purely parental leave or purely or encompassing all types of leave. One was the Strong Families Act, which has actually become law as part of the tax reform that happened in 2017, December of 2017, which basically offers a temporary tax credit to businesses that are voluntarily offering paid leave policies. There are conditions on how much of a tax credit you can get. The amount varies depending on how much leave and how much wage replacement the employees get, and it is focused on the lowest wage workers or people earning less than about $72,000 a year. We've also seen, just over the past month or so, a new bill from Senator Rubio talking about paid parental leave, which talks about allowing people to claim Social Security benefits early or retirement benefits early and use them to fund their paid leave. And it builds off the structure of the existing FMLA. So you get the job protection and you get the unpaid leave through the FMLA if you're eligible, but you can claim early benefits through Social Security. And the third is the WorkFlex in the 21st Century Act that is offering employers a way to sort of opt out of state and local laws by as long as you meet a certain number of days of providing paid leave to your employees. So we've seen, over the course of the previous year, new action on the legislative front. We've seen many private sector employers offering paid leave policies, and we're seeing a lot more action at the state level. When we started talking about paid family care and medical leave, we first said, okay, what are the existing systems that people have access to? So in terms of when you look at long-term medical leave, people have access to Social Security disability insurance. If you qualify, you can get, you can get some amount of paid leave through SSI, Supplemental Security Insurance. And employers have also provided long-term disability insurance, in the private sector. When you talk about very short-term or leaves ranging from about 6 months or so, you also have short-term disability insurance coming through the private sector, through private employers, also through state plans. But we also often find that when you talk about access to medical leave, people are thinking about paid sick days or using vacation days in order to cover, need for medical leave. So we in our report, we cover all the different types of ways in which people meet their need for medical leave, and I'm going to show you what access to those kinds of leave looks like. And finally, when you look at family care leave, again, when you look at the BLS report, it says only about 15% or 13 to 15% of people have access to parental and family care leave through their employer. But again, people end up using sick days, people end up using vacation days. Employers are allowing some sort of flexible, work or telecommuting in order to allow people to have access to days that they might need for caregiving needs. But this is what access looks like. So again, we have a lot of these kinds of charts in our report. And what immediately jumps out is that even when you combine all these different types of leave, access to leave is the worst for the lowest wage workers. So we've divided up, this chart into workers who are full-time or part-time workers, workers who are in the lowest income quartiles, people who are in the top, and workers working at small firms and at large firms. And again, you can see that if you tend to be part-time, if you tend to be a low-wage worker, if you're in a smaller or mid-sized business, access to all types of leave is actually much lower. We did another chart looking at access to leave by demographics. So who has leave? When you divide up the population into men, women, white, black, Hispanic, and then thirdly by education, and fourth by income. And again, you find the same sort of story coming out, which is that if you're a low-wage worker, if you have lower earnings, you're much more likely to take leave, but it's much more likely to be unpaid. If you're less educated, you're much more likely to take unpaid leave. Again, similarly for Hispanics and for women, there seem to be these disparities in access. So when you talk about paid leave, we have to remember that we're looking at different labor markets for different people. The access to leave varies a lot along several dimensions. So what are all the reasons for expanding paid leave access? When we talked about parental leave last year, the one big factor that we looked at was growing labor force participation by women. And that continues to be true because women tend to be the primary caregivers, not just for children, not just around parental reasons, but also around family caregiving for elders, for adults. And there's been a tremendous growth in women's labor force participation. Between 1970 and 1990, the participation rate for women in prime age years increased from half to nearly 3/4 of this population. Gains were even more dramatic for women with children. And this is not just for women. This is becoming a family issue. Men are equally involved in caregiving, in looking after children and performing these multiple roles. And that puts a lot more pressure on, when there are caregiving needs, when there is somebody who is sick or ill in the family and needs attention, who is going to provide that attention? And that's a big reason why we need to worry about these policies. The other factor, especially when looking at caregiving needs, is the aging of the population, and what we anticipate is going to be a huge demand in terms of the increased demand for care. What we find in the data is that informal caregiving is sort of the primary means for providing long-term care, and it's primarily being provided by people who are actually working. So these are not stay-at-home, providers of care, but really people who are working and who are trying to balance both of these needs. And the CBO estimates that demand for this kind of long-term care is only going to grow exponentially and substantially over the next several decades. Then next we started reviewing the literature on what are the economic impacts of medical and family care leave, right? And again, when we look back at the parental literature on this, parental leave literature, you find all these significant labor force participation effects and health effects, and we tried to do a similar thing for medical leave, and you will see that research reviewed in the report. But basically, when you look at own medical leave, the issue is people showing up for work when they're sick, how that affects their productivity, how that affects their ability to be actually functioning in the workforce. So having access to leave is obviously going to, be a huge benefit to them. And so when we look at medical leave, and given that we've seen what access looks like, and primarily people have either access to very short-term sick leave or longer-term leave through SSDI, we've sort of explored the idea of what happens if you have a bridge between these two extremes of leave taking, where you have a temporary disability insurance program, and our first panel is going to look at that. Secondly, when we looked at family care leave, again, it's the opportunity cost of caregivers not being in the workforce and being sort of primary caregivers and not being able to contribute in the labor market and earn incomes. So both types of leave have the potential to increase wages, improve labor force participation, and subsequently have impacts on economic growth. So we do think of this as an economic issue that affects all families and affects us as a nation. When you look at what existing state paid leave programs have provided, we have sort of the older programs like in California, New Jersey, Rhode Island that have paid family and medical leave systems, Hawaii, which does only medical leave through a TDI system. And then we've seen over the last couple of years a spurt of new states coming forward on paid leave policies. So we have Washington, we have New York and Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia has a paid leave program, and all of these will start kicking in at some point. There's a lot of variation across states in terms of duration of leave for each type of leave. So we're not talking about everybody gets 6 weeks for parental, family, and medical leave. There's a lot of variation at the state level on how much leave you get for each type of need. The benefit amounts vary, the financing structures vary, the definition of family varies, job protection regulations vary. We have, again, a really nice table in the report that details all of these programs. And what you find is that typically medical leave tends to be of the longest duration. It's also the costliest type of leave within the 3 types of leave. And then again, replacement rates vary from 50 to 90%. Some states have job protection, some states don't. So it's, we have a nice sort of evidence base for what's happening at the state level and what should a federal policy look like and how we can even start thinking about it. We also review some of the evidence on what is happening in the OECD. We typically hear that the OECD economies have these pretty generous programs, especially for parental leave, and we had looked at that last year, but also for family and caregiving leave. So we sort of did a tabulation of what leaves look like in the European economies and in the OECD generally. And again, it was surprising to us to find that it's actually not as widespread as we imagine it to be. So yes, there are a few countries that have very generous leaves for taking care of an adult relative or looking after children, but it's not as common as we had expected it to be. But leaves do tend to be longer, of longer duration and much more widely available when you look at medical leave. So when you look at leave for own illness, you get a very different picture. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Belle, and she's going to talk a little bit about our final findings on leave, our recommendations.
Wow, Aparna, that was a fantastic, very quick overview of the report, and I think gave a very good summary of the kind of data and information that's in it. And I just can't thank all the people who worked on it enough, including Aparna herself, obviously. And you're going to hear a lot more from our other working group members. As Aparna said, they have strong and independent voices. And so we're up here to give you some top lines. But I think this is an issue where we need to have a full and open debate, and we will. So thank you for being here. I just have a few slides, and just trying to figure out how I change them. Where is the, oh, it's the green, okay. Okay, so this first slide is about the fact that the American public is now pretty strongly in favor of paid leave. It varies by type of leave, and it varies by political affiliation, as you might expect. But the strongest support is for own medical leave, and the weakest support is for family caregiving leave. Republicans are understandably less enthusiastic than Democrats. However, even amongst Republicans, a small majority are in favor of paid leave. So this is sort of the Pew data, which everybody cites on this. I can tell you that I did focus groups myself and a listening tour last spring in connection with my new book, The Forgotten Americans. And what I heard from the Forgotten Americans, who are people without college degrees in the bottom half of the income distribution, is they really had concerns about this issue. I mean, I heard from one woman whose sister had cancer and who'd been driven into poverty as a result of that. So I'm not here to try to create tearjerker stories about this, and this is obviously anecdotal, but there is some much larger survey data, interesting survey data, showing that amongst elites, there's less recognition of how this affects people's everyday lives, experienced living, as opposed to the kind of high-level conversations we have here in Washington about everything from economic growth to income inequality. So this had an impact on me. Now, this is a rather wordy slide, as my research assistant Chris pointed out to me when he put it together, and I decided to leave it wordy because I was concerned that I would misrepresent what our group thinks. And I may still have misrepresented it, but this was my effort to summarize our top conclusions. As Aparna said, last year we did come out with a compromise proposal on parental leave. And I say compromise because nobody loved it. For those of a more liberal bent, it was not generous enough, and for those of a more conservative bent, it was a step too far. And I think it's very useful, though, that we kept fighting about it, talking about it, and we finally, with a little browbeating from Aparna and myself, people on both the left and the right came out with this compromise, and that's what's going to have to happen in the political system as well. So that's why I think our discussions have been instructive, not just from a substantive perspective, but from a political perspective as well, if you will. On medical leave, we thought that there is this gap, Aparna already alluded to it, between short-term sick leave that a lot of people get through their employers, not everyone, I should point out, especially not low income, and SSDI, or long-term disability insurance, which requires that you be pretty much permanently disabled and unable to work. And there's nothing in between, if you break your leg, if you get a bout of cancer or whatever. And so we think that there is, it's worth considering and exploring some kind of temporary medical leave at the national level, as opposed to the state level, but looking hard at how that interfaces with both sick leave on the one hand and long-term disability on the other. So that's going to take more work. We haven't gotten in the details. We still have issues there, but we hope and expect to be able to do a lot more work on that in the next year or so. Finally, on family caregiving leave, this was the area where we had the biggest disagreements, with people of a more progressive bent thinking that it was a no-brainer to provide this to people, that they really need it, and that it could be bundled in with the other two types of leave very easily, as it often is, or commonly is, at the state level. And on the other hand, there were another group that felt equally strongly that it was premature, that there wasn't that much unmet need, that it was open to additional expense and possible abuse. So they were not comfortable with going there. You're going to hear a lot more about both medical leave and family caregiving leave, so I won't say more right now. I want to end with what I think was one of the biggest contributions of this working group to the whole discussion and debate about this issue. And that is, we did some very serious modeling and estimation of the costs of all three types of paid leave. And I really you're going to hear from the modeling group a little later today, but I really want to flag their efforts, which were extensive, and they really worked together, and they used different data sources and different modeling techniques, and then they tried to find out why it was their estimates didn't all agree and what was driving the differences. And this is the bottom line on what they found. And as you can see very clearly, medical leave is the most expensive form of leave. Family caregiving leave right now is the least expensive form of care. It does depend on what your assumptions are, and we used the assumptions based on the behavior we've seen on in the federal FMLA bill, the unpaid family leave bill, and we looked at the state behaviors, and right here what's modeled is California only for simplicity. And finally, we looked at a simulation model that was developed by Jeff Hayes and his colleagues at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and which tries to build in behavioral responses to the parameters of the program, both what individuals will do and what employers would do in response to a new program. So I just think this was a really important part of our work. So I'm going to stop there and call up our first panel to begin a little more detailed discussion. And if you'll just come up right now, we'll turn this over to all of you. Don't leave, because we're going to continue here.
Thanks, Bill. So this panel is going to look at the issue of medical leave, and as we mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about our discussions within the group on how to do medical leave in the U.S. What should a federal policy on medical leave look like? We'll begin with Harry. Harry Holzer is the John Lafarge Jr. S.J. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University and an Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. Abby McCloskey is an economist and political commentator. She is the founder of McCloskey Policy LLC and was formerly at AEI. Chris Room is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Virginia. He previously served as senior economist on President Bill Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. So, Harry, I'm going to start with you.
Should we?
Yeah, you can go now.
Is someone loading?
It's already loaded.
Oh,
So
it is?
you can use the clicker.
I went backwards, maybe shouldn't have done that. Go
This one?
forwards again.
Yeah. No, that's going back.
Wrong. Oh, you're right. The red one. Technical change disadvantages unskilled workers like me. So what I thought I would do to start off this panel is to sort of give you a review of the landscape. What are the different ways in which we can provide paid family leave? What does each level of government do right now? And it's a little bit about costs and benefits, and then kind of turn it over to my co-panelists to give you a little more background on that. So I think of really sort of 5 buckets of medical leave policy provided mostly by the government and also by employers. These are the 5 that I list. The federal government, as you've heard before, mandates unpaid leave. Not to everybody, but to most workers are covered by that through FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. A set of governments, state and local, provide sick days usually a limited number of sick days. Other governments, often at the state level, provide a combination of paid family or medical leave, usually for some number of weeks, and there's often flexibility about how much you can take as family as opposed to medical, whereas other states provide the medical part through TDI, which was mentioned before, temporary disability insurance. And then finally, as we heard before, at least some employers provide paid medical leave to their employees, but far from all of them. So let me just say a couple of words about each of those forms. FMLA is a guarantee of unpaid leave for 12 weeks, both for medical and family needs. It does come with some limited job protection. APT did a nice survey on this and a nice report a number of years ago, so they give you a little bit of a sense of what those numbers look like. And by the way, this is only guaranteed to workers in firms of 50 or more workers. So a fairly big chunk of the workforce works at smaller firms than that, and they are not even covered by unpaid leave in this sense. But what we learned in the app report is, and because it's unpaid, people will likely take less of it, and for shorter periods than they would if it were in fact paid. So some of these numbers in some sense could be thought of as a lower bound to what you would see if in fact the coverage was paid. In the app report, about 13% of all workers took one of those forms of leave, and 7% were medical. The medical leaves were 34 days on average. That's almost 7 weeks of coverage. So if you think of 7% of the workforce took an average of 5 weeks, it's not an enormous burden of employers. But again, think of that as a lower bound to what you'd see if it was paid. And of course, a lot of lower income folks believe they can't afford to take unpaid leave even when it's available to them. So what else do we see? Well, we see paid sick days in mandated paid sick days in 10 states, 32 cities, often large cities, and 2 counties. And the system is always workers accrue an hour of paid sick day for every 30 to 50 hours that they work. So if you multiply that out, it comes out to about 40 to 60 hours of paid sick time per worker. On average, it's about 5 to 8 paid sick days. In other words, that's sort of a strong case of the flu would eat up most of that. So it's a very small amount and mostly short term. So we generally don't regard that as being sufficient for what people need when they're really ill. Then next, there's a set of states that provide a combination of paid family and medical. Actually, 5 states, the ones I've listed there, plus the District of Columbia. 4 out of those 6 provide the medical leave through a TDI policy, temporary disability insurance. And 3 of those states already had that in place before they provided. So it seemed like a small extra step to build paid family and parental on top of the TDI policies that they already had. And these states, the amount, the duration, the replacement rates vary. You know, the first 3 states doing this, which were California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, started with only 4 to 6 weeks of parental and family on top of the TDI. And again, I think the fact that they had fairly generous TDI meant that they didn't have to build quite as much on top of it, and they all started with like 55%, 60% replacement rates. States more recently have been more generous, and some offer up to 12 weeks and up to 70% replacement. And again, in many cases, just building on top of the TDI policies they had. And then the flip side of the court is these are the states that provide some kind of TDI. So you see there's a lot of overlap between these two. And all but Hawaii went and built the paid family leave on top of that. So again, once you have one, it's quite easy to build the others into it. And then, of course, as mentioned before, you know, some employers choose to provide this, but mostly to their highly educated professional and managerial employees, or you see some of broader coverage in larger firms. So if you were to sum up what's the total state, and again, this is consistent with some of the charts that Aparna and Bell showed you, the federal government mandates only unpaid, which a lot of people can't afford to take. Only a handful, 6 or 7 states, mandate paid medical or family on their own. And then you have the set of employers providing it mostly to their high-end employees. So the bottom line is the majority of workers in America do not have paid medical coverage, even though, which we think is unfortunate, because as again was said earlier, we think there's a variety of benefits and I've listed the most important three: better health and productivity of the workers, better retention of employees for employers, because the workers don't have to quit when they get sick. They have a mechanism for keeping their job, and also better labor force participation, which was pointed out earlier. And we need better labor force participation in the United States. Labor force attachment has been declining now for several decades for most groups, including prime-age men, and it's been declining for women, prime-age women, for the last 10 to 15 years as well. So we, I think as a group, put a lot of emphasis on one of the great benefits you get from these policies is that it would, we think, stimulate attachment to the labor force. People wouldn't have to leave the labor force when they have a somewhat lengthy illness. And as we said, we think those benefits accrue not only to the employees themselves, but to the economy, and even in some cases to employers, which is why some employers choose to do it voluntarily. But again, there's costs that I'll talk about in a minute, and that's why a lot of employers do not. In fact, most employers do this. They see it as an investment, and they're willing to make these investments for their professional and managerial employees, whom they think merit the investment the most. Their most trusted workers, the workers they think are going to stick around for the longest time. They seem less willing to make those same investments in other workers, although we think from an economy-wide point of view that they merit that. How strong is the evidence on these benefits? Not as strong as we would like it to be, frankly. We have some good studies, mostly coming out of California, but really, some by people who are on the panel. But the California studies really look at, once TDI was already in place, what extra economic benefits did you get from adding paid family on top of that? So it's really, you have stronger evidence, I think, on the family piece than on the underlying medical or TDI coverage. Now, there is another important benefit that a lot of us think about. It's possible that if you institute a temporary disability insurance program where it doesn't exist right now, which is in most states, that would actually lower the SSDI rolls because people wouldn't have to leave permanently. They've had this option of going out just for a shorter time period. So that could be a really important benefit and could help pay for the programs. Unfortunately, there's only one study that looked at it, and the results suggested that it reduced SSDI coverage, but the numbers were a little loose and all over the place, and so I don't think even the authors themselves thought of it as firm evidence. But it's strongly suggested that one might be one of the additional benefits of providing TDI. So lastly, let me just put some of the questions. Oh, I'm sorry, these are the costs. And I think interesting, some of us on the panel, I think, worried more about the cost to employers than others. I think the three of us on this panel, actually the four of us on this panel, probably consistently took the costs more seriously or worried more about them, which made us then sometimes be a little less, to argue for a little less generosity on the benefit side. But first of all, it would almost in all cases amount to some additional tax, likely shared between workers and employers. There is a disruption of the workplace when people leave. And of course, the disruption is worse the longer people go out for it. And in some of those cases, employers will have to hire temps to do that work, and that's an additional cost they bear as well. We worried a lot about whether employers would start to discriminate in hiring against the groups that they thought most likely to need the leave in the first place. And when we thought about it, I think we believed that the biggest risk was actually for parental leave, right? Because parental leave, women in their childbearing years, you can identify those as a group that will likely need the parental piece. It's not as easy, we think, for employers to identify workers that they think will need medical coverage, but it's not impossible for them to do that either. If they have any sense that people come with some pre-existing condition or some health problem, under these regimes, they would be more reluctant to hire those folks, and we worry about that as well. I often worried about not this cost alone, but in a set of states, mostly blue states, that are mandating a lot of extra costs on businesses for their employees. $15 minimum wages, various kinds of paid leave, band-the-box, et cetera, that the sum of all those costs might be greater than each of them individually. So that's another, I think, thing to keep in mind. So for all those reasons, many of us wanted to have a limited duration of this and a replacement rate that wasn't too high. And we all like the idea of a cap, because the whole idea of a cap is low-income people would get the entire percentage covered. People who go above the cap in income would see progressively lower rates of coverage, and we thought that was a good thing to make it progressive. So how do you sum up all this? And since the federal government does nothing on the paid leave side, if they were going to mandate leave, what are some of the questions we'd have to ask? Well, these are some of the questions. If you provide medical, should it be done through a TDI policy or through a more general paid family and medical, 8 weeks covering both? And by the way, the TDI programs that are out there vary a great deal across the states in terms of how generous they are. I think Rhode Island begins with a small number of weeks, sometimes renewable, 4 weeks, something like that, whereas New Jersey gives up to a half a year. So states have a lot of leeway, and the federal government could also choose along that. And for those of us that think that 4 weeks, there's not a lot between 4 weeks and permanent disability, that there's a lot of space in between that, and maybe a serious TDI policy could help fill some of that space. Especially if you go TDI, should it be linked somehow administratively to the SSDI system? Because in some ways they complement each other a lot. And should it be linked to SSDI reform, which I think Belle mentioned in her talk? I strongly believe that the SSDI program needs reforms. And I think Abby's going to talk even more about that. I support that case. And I think it makes a great, both politically and economically, there's a strong case being made by combining SSDI reform with an additional TDI policy coverage. And then there's a question of, well, how do we pay for this? Should it be a brand new tax, or should it be carved out of existing taxes? As you might guess, the Republicans in our group more favored the carve out, and the Democrats more favored the new taxes. One can imagine a political compromise that involves some of both. That if SSDI reform generates some savings in the program, that at least some of those savings could be used to fund the new TDI, along with maybe a modest tax bump as well. So those are some of the options. So as you can see, I really like the idea of federal TDI linked to SSDI reform, paid for partially with saved money and partially with new taxes. If the federal government can't agree on any of this stuff, which of course is the case today, an alternative is to leave this whole thing to the states, but maybe with some federal financial support for doing so. And that's an alternative that I think none of us thought was the best approach, but maybe a second best. So I'll stop there and hear more from our colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Harry. And I, too, want to start by thanking Aparna and Belle for pulling this group together and what often felt like herding cats. Thank you for herding us, and also for incorporating so many different viewpoints into the paper. We appreciate it. I want to start where Harry left off, explaining in a bit more detail the idea of incorporating a TDI-type system, a temporary disability insurance system, as part of SSDI reform. And importantly, this is a new approach to what's previously been discussed when we talk about paid medical leave at the federal level. And it's an approach I think could generate significant bipartisan support. And if there's time, I'd like to close with just a few comments about paid parental leave, given all that's happened in that space since this group last convened. Press the green button.
Yeah.
Witnesses? Well, that's fine. When it comes to paid medical leave at the federal level, there's really only been one approach on the table, and that's the Family Act, which would provide 12 weeks of paid medical leave and the same for parental and family leave. There's a lot to like about this approach. It dovetails with FMLA, which provides 12 weeks of job-protected leave. And there's simplicity and a fairness in treating all types of leave the same. But there are also downsides of the Family Act, the expense of the program and the fact that it's wholly funded by higher payroll taxes and likely more than its supporters have suggested. And the fact that because it provides paid leave for a wide variety of uses, it could result in frequent and recurring periods of leave that are difficult to verify and difficult for employers to manage, and could crowd out existing options as Aparna laid out the coverage that already exists for family and medical leave. And last of all, and I think most importantly, and what I want to talk about this afternoon, is that it doesn't account for the existing system in place. And so I would like to talk about an alternative approach. And I'm sorry, oh, my slides are working now. Here we go. Perfect. So unlike for parental or family leave, we do have a federal system in place when it comes to paid medical leave, and that's a Social Security Disability Insurance Program, which provides income replacement to people who are chronically ill and usually out of the labor force entirely. This makes it a very natural place to expand and consider housing a shorter-term medical leave as well. But SSDI faces some significant challenges. Enrollment has tripled since the 1980s, reaching almost 9 million people. That's about 3 times the size of the city of Chicago. A lot of people are on SSDI, despite no notable increase in work-limiting illnesses that people report they have. As a result, there's significant financial pressure on the fund. It's expected to be insolvent by 2032. In the past, we've been able to divert payroll taxes to help shore up the fund. That will be more difficult going forward as Social Security more broadly faces the same financial challenges. And it's also become increasingly clear that SSDI is contributing, as Harry had mentioned, to our low labor force participation rate. There is essentially no in-between option to blend a severe medical illness or need with work. And as a result, we believe that many people who are currently on SSDI could work if given the option to do so. And those estimates range anywhere from 25 to 50% of certain types of SSDI recipients with the ability to work. And so there's this is not breakthrough information, there's broad bipartisan support for reforming SSDI. President Obama and President Trump have had proposals in their various budgets to do so. Many of the proposals are overlapping. But this is a chance to go a step further and rethink how we provide medical leave as a country more broadly. And specifically, reforms that tighten access to SSDI could be paired with the creation of a national TDI system. There's a lot we don't know, Harry mentioned that, but there are potentially 5 benefits of this type of approach. The first is improving the solvency of SSDI to the extent that there's a temporary option and people could be diverted to a temporary option instead of receiving permanent disability benefits. And it could also generate the political will to tackle and make the hard reforms to SSDI without the worry that people with serious medical conditions would be left without any sort of safety net or coverage. The second potential advantage is what could happen with labor force attachment. Again, we believe that the significant portion of people on the brink of SSDI benefits could work if given the option. There's no option to do so right now. That creating that optionality around blending work and leave could boost labor force attachment, which would not only have economic growth and macroeconomic considerations and benefits to it, but also help the individual to stay attached to their profession, to their colleagues, to their job. The third potential benefit, I think is an interesting one, is that a TDI system could target assistance towards those who need it the most. Shorter term periods of medical leave are already likely to be covered. 72% of workers have access to sick leave. 66% of workers who take medical leave are paid. Okay, but the longer an illness stretches out, the longer you're out of work, the more difficult it is to patch together vacation days and sick days and rely on your own savings and family and friends. And in my opinion, which is admittedly a more conservative one, this is where the case for a federal government safety net, a backstop, becomes the strongest for conditions that it is near impossible to predict and self-insure against yourself. And even if the Family Act were implemented, it would leave a gap between those who have an illness ending at 12 weeks and the status quo, which is SSDI not picking up unless it's really a permanently debilitating condition. Fourth, not that we're going backwards, fourth is that it could be paid for in part by existing spending reform. So instead of jumping to increase payroll taxes, that the payments for a TDI program could in part be found from SSDI reform. SSDI is a massive program. It is more than the size of wage subsidies, welfare, housing support, all combined. And moving forward, given our current fiscal situation, with an approach that balances reforms to existing spending and taxation, I think is prudent. And fifth, while this is a relatively new idea on the national level, we do have state-based experience with TDI programs going back all the way to the 1940s. And I believe the next phase of research with AEI and Brookings will be looking into those programs and if there's more that we can understand from them. Because there are a lot of unanswered questions. How would this interact with SSDI in practice? As Harry said, would it actually reduce the rules? Would it increase labor force participation? Could it crowd out private sector alternatives? And in my mind, I think it should function as a backstop, as a last option for people who've exhausted all other forms of support. And so in the report you have before you, we recommend studying this approach further before any sort of national implementation. But I do think it has promise as a bipartisan solution. 85% of Americans want paid medical leave, and there's been an impasse between one side wanting new paid leave programs without any regard to what's already there, and the other blocking any new program irrespective of its benefits because of deficit and debt concerns. And it does appear that a way forward is going to be some sort of reprioritization of existing spending to better support the people who need help the most. And that's why I support some type of shorter medical leave, some part of TDI as part of SSDI reform. And because I haven't been pulled off the stage just yet, just a few comments on parental leave. That there is growing bipartisan consensus on paid parental leave as a public option. Senator Rubio last month became the first congressional Republican to put forward a paid parental leave plan that the government would run and manage. And it is hard to overstate how significant of a sea change this is from where the paid leave debate was even 2 years ago. And I think it's tremendous progress. Understandably, many people would wish that this also included medical leave and family leave. But as we wrote about in our first AEI-Brookings report on parental leave, as I think a year into the research on medical and family leave show, the evidence is still the strongest for paid parental leave in terms of its effect on the labor market, the effect on children's health, maternal health, and just the straightforwardness and ease of the policy to verify, administer, and manage. And so I do think that moving forward with paid parental leave as a standalone policy is a good place to start and give immediate help to millions of parents around the country while giving time to get medical leave right and to build a comprehensive system of benefits that directs need to where it is needed the most instead of adding to the patchwork system that exists currently. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. Good luck with the clicker, Chris. May you have better luck than me.
The green button or the red button?
It's the green
Green
one.
is forward, red is back.
Biggest challenge.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Let's see. What did I just do?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So here's a little truth in advertising. First, I should say I want to thank Bell and Aparna for herding the cats. I mean, they really did an amazing job. And I think the report that you all have is really a very impressive document. And, I can't overstate what a great job they did. But they gave our panel the hardest job, I think, here. And to be honest about this, I think it's fair to say the medical leave piece is the most complicated and probably the one we understand the least well. And so you'll hear in this conversation, we'll kind of mix in a little bit of parental and a little bit of family, because the parental leave actually, I think we are a pretty diverse group. We don't agree, as Belle said, on the details, but we're pretty close. On medical leave, I actually am not sure we're far apart. I would just say I'm not sure where we are because it's so complicated. So what I'm going to do here, and I'll try to be fairly brief, is sort of talk a little bit about what we kind of currently have and then think about going forward if we were not to do what Abby just talked about, kind of the big reform, but some of the smaller questions. And then I'll try to come back a little bit to some of those big issues at the end. So what I have here is a chart showing essentially the add-on paid leave laws in the 5 states and D.C. that have them in place currently. And I should actually have left off Massachusetts, which has now passed a program that will come into place in 2021. And it's actually looking like a lot of the later programs. So here I'm talking about the Washington, the D.C. programs. It has some common features. I also want to be clear, and I'll say more about this, that this is for the first, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see the board. The first 4 states here are TDI states. So this is an addition to the temporary disability insurance programs that they have, and I'll say more about that. But you have a different version of this in your report, or a kind of similar version. What I want you to notice here are a couple of things. First, these are, as I said, these are add-ons to TDI in the 4 states that have it. The 5th, we have 1 state left, Hawaii, that has TDI, hasn't added a separate program at least yet. But in the early programs, you're talking about short durations, relatively low replacement rates, and also treatment of medical leave and family leave and parental leave pretty much all the same. In the later states, you have longer leaves. That's partly because they don't add it onto a TDI program. And you have more differentiation. You'll have often shorter medical leave programs than the other kinds of programs. You might have a maximum amount. I'll add Massachusetts, which is not in here, actually has longer medical leave than parental leave, but they also have a kind of a capped amount. So we've got programs that are typically durations. The standalone pieces may be 4 to 12 weeks. If you add it on to TDI in the states that have it, you actually could be talking often, 30 weeks or quite a long period of time. Okay, so I think I've said most of this, but I'm going to come at the end to the kind of political considerations, but I want to note one thing that makes me a little more pessimistic about the grand reform plan, and that is we have 5 states that put TDI programs in place. They all put them in place in the 1940s. And one thing I have to wonder a little bit about is if none of the other states have done it since then, are we really, what are the barriers and how much confidence should we have at the federal level that we can do the grand reform? I mean, actually, I support that. I should say I should support that in principle. I do worry about the practicality of doing that. And so one question is, okay, maybe we should work to that, but in the meantime, can we think about sort of an add-on program that perhaps is a little bit smaller in scope that might also be useful? So lots of questions here. How much do the state? I mean, we often think of the states as an experiment. There's questions. How much do we learn from state programs? What does that tell us for a federal program? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think we learn some, but federal programs are going to be different. So, for example, one important difference is in a state program, often the information is fairly limited. Although for employers, for example, are required to post the information on the availability of leave. How many workers actually understand that it's there? We have evidence that awareness may be low. In a federal program, awareness is likely to be dramatically higher because there's going to be a whole infrastructure of providing that information. That could be a good thing. It means take-up of people who need it is likely to be higher. It also could mean costs may be higher than an equivalent state program. One of the really valuable exercises here that you're going to hear about later was the costing exercise that was done. To some extent, that was using information from states, and we want to be a little cautious about how transferable those estimates are likely to be. Okay, so just a few points I want to make about family and medical leave versus parental leave. We're going to have potentially more concerns by employers about what's often referred to by economists as moral hazard. That's actually a terrible name because there's nothing about morals that comes into play, but it simply says when you have a program in place, there's going to be incentives to use it. Some of that use will be appropriate and desirable. Some of that use might or might not be. And so when you're talking about something like family or medical leave, it becomes much harder to know, what is appropriate and inappropriate use. So, for example, what kind of a medical problem justifies taking leave from work? For how long can that leave be taken? They're not clear answers, so some in our group were quite confident that if we could use physician certification. as a way to solve that problem. So in my other hat, I'm a health economist. Health economists worry all the time about how people game the system, and so we may be concerned that, there could be some of that going on. We also know, by the way, physicians, they like to keep their patients happy. And it's not costly to you as a physician to sign a document saying you have some medical need. In many cases, it may be costly to you in terms of losing a patient if you don't sign that document. I'm simply saying these are complicating issues. I don't have answers to them. I just think we want to be a little cautious in our interpretation. But I'll also add, maybe we shouldn't even worry about these. Maybe I'm worrying too. Maybe Harry and I, we were the ones who kept raising this in our working group sessions. Maybe we're worrying too much, because the fact is there are 5 states that have temporary disability programs in place, and we don't seem to be seeing massive amounts of these kinds of activities that I'm talking about. So maybe I'm just worrying too much. I would like to have a little bit better knowledge base to know that, but those are points to make. So just a couple of points specifically about medical leave. I mentioned at the start, this is more complicated than the others, and part of it is because we have medical leave coming in so many different forms already. So we have sick leave. Many, I think probably most employers provide sick leave, although we know there's wide disparities in the availability of getting sick leave. Some places have mandates of sick leave. We also know that employers are increasingly going to some kind of umbrella categories of leave. So often it'll be called something like paid time off work. Presumably, if a sick leave mandate, for example, is put in place, some employers will respond by reducing the amount of paid time off work separately and then adding in sick leave. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a complicating issue. We've talked about temporary disability insurance, and then the long-term disability insurance programs, and particularly here the federal program. So I guess the bottom line for me is, this is tough. This is a really tough issue. I wish we had good answers for you. I do think, the next step is to think about where we go from here on this. I think that's probably the AEI-Brookings Group are going to be working on that. I do want to be hesitant, though, about jumping to saying the magic bullet is let's just reform SSDI, and that generates a whole lot of money that we can then put into some kind of a federal temporary disability insurance program. Why do I want to be cautious about that? Well, the first is, I think, the general atmosphere of distrust inside and outside of Washington. Can we get anything done? And can we get things done that are fair? One of the things the disability insurance system is designed to do is to protect those who really can't work. The problem is that is hard to define, right? None of this is saying we shouldn't try and that we can't do better. But for example, mental illness is a big deal. That's one reason why a lot of people can't work, and yet it's very hard to objectively measure. And so the trick here is, how do we come up with a program that one, provides reform that saves money, that also provides desirable incentives to get people back to work, but also without penalizing groups that really need those benefits. And by the way, those often tend to be the most disadvantaged among us. It's a real challenge. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to all of you for your comments. Before I turn over to the audience, when we started the working group last year in September, we said, why not just bundle all these types of leave into one, right? And Abby talked a little bit about, why not do something like what the Family Act does, which is have a uniform number of weeks. So like we said for parental, let's do 8 weeks, 70% wage replacement. Why not do medical leave the same way? So I just wanted, all of you to sort of quickly give us a flavor of why we decided to sort of look at medical leave differently or separately, what your concerns are with that approach. And how you think we could. So Chris mentioned some of the concerns with doing a federal TDI, but whether you think this might work or might not work.
I guess the reason I like a slightly different one that explicitly has a TDI program, is that if you only do it some batch of weeks, 8 or 12, which people can divide up, it still leaves a huge gap between that and permanent disability. And the permanent disability system in some ways incentivizes people with some disability to leave the workforce forever, which is not to say that in most cases they really have a real disability. They do, but the incentives in some ways are wrong. The incentives ought to be to try to limit how much disability, and for both employers and employees to get back into the workforce quickly. So if you bundle them all into an 8 or 12-week program, you don't have that nice middle step that I think TDI provides. Now, having said that, and Chris was right that we really don't have a lot of evidence, although the state evidence on TDI is pretty good. What I would really like to see is some serious pilot programs done at the federal level. And there are a range of proposals out there, some from Democrats, some from Republicans, with a lot of overlap between them. Let's pilot several of them, plus a TDI piece, and then try to see what do we learn from that, before we rush into a full. So I think that a pilot of SSDI reform plus TDI would, I think, help to plug in some of the holes in our knowledge, right? And of course, doesn't answer everything. There's always big questions about what happens when you go to scale. But I think that's what I would like, which I think could be done quickly. And then we learn from that within a short number of years and do something more serious.
Yes, I agree with Harry on the pilot approach. I do think that the different types of leave, they're all paid leave. That's about all they have in common. They are very different, parental leave and family leave and medical leave. If anything, I think family and medical leave are more similar than the parental piece. The evidence is the strongest, I think we agreed as a group, behind parental leave. And as you can see with a wide variety of scholars, not only here, but then in the political world as well, there is more momentum behind a parental leave plan, and I don't think that should be stopped. I think it should be moved forward because we have a significant evidence base to support it, whereas medical leave and family leave are more complicated. Medical leave, we do have an existing system to consider, and I tend to think it's less than responsible to add another paid medical leave program without being honest about the serious challenges that we face with the existing program and getting that right so that we can provide help in a sustainable way, but also to the people who need it most.
So I worry a little bit that we could come back and have another one of these panels in 10 years and have very much the same discussion we're having today about medical leave, talking about the problems with SSDI and the gaps. If I had my druthers, I would support having a program that had more uniform components of paid medical and family leave, possibly with some of the things that I think I had on my slides but didn't talk about. I would certainly put in a longer waiting period for medical leave. I might think about some kind of lower replacement rate, but getting something that fills the gap to at least some degree, I think would be desirable while we think about working towards the long-term reform that solves all the problems. Yes, if we had, say, 8 weeks of some kind of 8 weeks of short-term medical leave, that is not going to eliminate the gaps. It also will not end the disincentives for work in long-term Social Security disability insurance, but it would provide 8 weeks versus 0 for a lot of people. So I would like us to see us go forward. Now, politically, I agree with Abby that right now the momentum we have is on parental leave, and I would take that versus nothing. But I would not want to imply that somehow we're magically going to solve the issue of the gaps in medical leaves through some reform. And so until we do that, we should do nothing.
Great. Turning over to the audience.
Hi, I'm Whitney Pesic, and I'm with 0 to 3. And I just want to clarify a little bit this talk of parental leave. From our perspective, what's being called parental leave really doesn't take into account the needs of parents. A worker that is able to take off for their newborn baby, but a coworker that has a chronically ill 6-month-old, or a coworker who has a spouse that needs postpartum support doesn't have the option of leave. And we just also believe that babies exist within families that have a variety of caregiving needs, and to only allow parents the time to care for that baby really isn't the best way to support strong child development. Thank you.
Do you want to react?
Yeah, I think family leave is important, and that'll be discussed more in the next panel. But again, I do think, as you mentioned, the scope of illnesses a child or parent or relative can have is broad. The length of leave is broad. The verification is difficult. It's just a very different policy than, childbirth is never easy, I will say, but it is straightforward in terms of a similar length of time, and it's easy to verify, and that becomes much more difficult when you move into the broader family and medical leave space. And I do really strongly believe that we need more time to get it right so that can actually be a comprehensive policy and not just a quick fix.
So I think you're going to hear in the next panel, but I mean, our group is split, frankly, on family leave. I think it's fair to say the majority of the group would feel the way you do, at least on the family leave piece. Now, that doesn't mean we would all agree on the particulars, but there are other people in the group who feel like the evidence base isn't there. So, we're split.
Yeah, we'll have a big discussion of that in the second panel. Any other questions? Okay, great. We'll invite the second panel on board. Thank you. Thank you very much.
For those of you who are leaving, we're going to start up again right away. So if you want to hear this panel, you should come back quickly. Do we have any additional name tags? Is Aaron here?
I'll just put these down.
Did you see this?
Aaron, are you around? Okay.
Not as tall as Abby. So.
No one is as tall as
Sure.
Abby.
Sure. Okay, so now we get to the most controversial issue within our working group, and that is leave for caregiving. And we have 4 people here who are going to talk about it, who were stalwart members of our group and are all very articulate and strong-minded on what they think. And we are going to go in the following order. We're going to start with Ben Gittes. And Ben is with the American Action Forum, and he was a critical player in this group, and especially on some of the cost work, which you'll hear about later. But he also has some strong views about this issue. And then we're going to hear from Angela Rashidi, who is a research fellow at AEI. And then we're going to hear from Jane Walfogel, who's a professor at Columbia University. And finally, from Heather Bushey, who has written and worked extensively in this area. Have to give a ad for your last 2 books. The most recent is on inequality, but the one before that, and she produces one about every year, was called Finding Time. And I found the book Finding Time one of the best sources I've seen on this set of issues. So with that, over to you, Ben.
Well, thank you for having me here today. My name is Ben Gittes. I'm from the American Action Forum. It's definitely been a true pleasure for me to be a part of this working group for the last couple of years, and I'm really proud of everything we have accomplished. So with that said, I'm going to talk about why I am why I do not think there's a compelling case to provide paid leave specifically for family caregiving. And to start out, there is simply a lot we do not know about this issue. We don't know how the paid leave benefits for family caregiving looks in the private sector very well. We don't know really what the impact is of providing a paid leave program for family caregiving is. And Angela's going to talk more about the evidence we have of those programs. But right now, I'm going to focus on the private sector. And in my view, what we do know tends to indicate that paid leave for family caregiving is actually pretty widely available. So there is a statistic out there that we commonly hear from the National Compensation Survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that indicates that 15% of workers are provided a paid family leave benefit, which would seem to suggest there really isn't a lot of paid leave available for family caregiving. But when you actually look at the workers who take family leave, particularly for caregiving, about 2/3 of people are actually paid by their employers. And for family caregiving in particular, it's about over 70%. So just considering these numbers on their face, there's something that really is not adding up. Why is there such a huge discrepancy? So I've decided to take a look at what is going on. How are people who are taking leave getting by, and how are they getting paid? I should also note, those who are getting paid by their employers are receiving most of them are receiving their full regular paycheck. So when folks are taking paid leave, and for taking care of an ill family member, 77% are using a general paid time off or PTO benefit that is unspecified and intended for any option or any reason a worker needs. And this type of benefit is becoming more and more available, and employers are offering it more often. And so workers can use it for vacation, sick days, and even parental leave or family caregiving.
Ben, the gremlins have gotten rid of your chart for some reason. Maybe you want to punch the
Oh,
button.
I did not prepare a presentation for this, or a PowerPoint.
We're not using PowerPoints.
Yeah, that was.
Oh, there was a slide up there a moment ago. Was that an old slide?
Left over.
Sorry.
Oh, it's all right.
There's a big lag here for some reason.
No worries. So 77% are receiving PTO. Another 45% are using personal days. And only 10% are using sick days, 7% are using vacation days. So what is this telling us? For anybody who's keeping track of the math, this adds up to way over 100%. So workers are using multiple benefits to piece it together. And in my view, when I'm looking over this evidence, it's pretty clear that employers are offering paid family leave. They're just not calling it paid family leave. They're calling it PTO. Another interesting point we found in this data was that it varies considerably by family income level. Those in lower income households are less likely to receive paid leave than those in higher income households, which is fairly logical. And this applies specifically for parental leave and for medical leave. But when you look at family caregiving, even those in the lowest income households are paid fairly frequently, or more than you'd think. So considering parental leave, 18% of workers from low income households who take the leave are paid by their employer, which is not very many. For family caregiving, that number jumps to about 50%. So to me, there isn't much of a compelling case even for the lowest income people when considering family caregiving. So I should also pause. I don't want to give the impression that this data tells the entire story here. And this also underlines how much we don't know. For instance, we don't know whether the paid leave benefits used by people who are taking it are also available to those who are not taking leave and the rest of the workforce. And it could be, one concern could be that people who are taking leave are only doing so because they have the paid leave benefit. But the problem is there is no strong evidence to indicate one way or the other or to definitively determine what's going on. But of the evidence I have come across seems to suggest that those who are taking paid leave have benefits that are similar to the rest of the private sector. And there are three pieces of evidence. First, unmet leave in the private sector is somewhat limited. The Apt Associates survey that Harry cited earlier found that only 5% of workers needed to take leave but were unable to do so. The Pew Foundation, the Pew Research Center, did a survey also of people who were taking family and medical leave. They found similar results in that 2/3 of folks who were taking leave were being paid by their employer. But they also found that in 2016, 13% were being paid with a defined paid family and medical leave benefit. And that's interesting because that's, in the same year, matches the portion of folks who are being paid or who are offered that benefit for the entire private sector. So that also suggests that the mix of benefits available to those who are taking leave are similar to the entire workforce. And finally, when you look at take-up of family leave by household income, it is actually quite similar across income level. In fact, folks in the lowest income level are slightly more likely to take leave than those in the highest income level. And that's important because, like I mentioned before, those in the lowest income households are much less likely to receive pay. So that seems to suggest, in my view, that the existence of a paid leave benefit does not have too much say in someone's decision whether or not to take leave. So to summarize, what does this really mean if you were to enact a new paid leave benefit for family caregiving? Well, if you think about the bottom line for the workers who are taking family leave, for most of them, it would not really change. Most of the money that would be spent on that would go to people who already have it. And at best, for a lot of those workers, the source of the benefit would change, and the name of it would change from PTO to paid family leave. And the source would change from their employer to the federal government. At worst, and this is something I am concerned about, since most folks in the private sector who are paid are already getting their full weekly paycheck, most proposals that are out there, we compare that to most proposals out there, which would provide a portion of their weekly paycheck. I am concerned that this would displace their private sector benefits, and on net, they could see a cut in their benefit. And we see this happening in California, where private sector paid leave benefits have declined in response to the state-run paid leave program. And with that, I'll let Angela take over. Thank you.
So I also don't have any slides, so I'm just going to stay here, if that's okay. I also want to just quickly thank Aparna and Belle for providing me the opportunity to join the group, but really doing a very good job of really listening to everybody and incorporating everybody's views. That doesn't always happen, so I appreciate that very much. I also want to do a quick plug, because Ben didn't really mention it. Ben did a really good report for the American Action Forum that summarized a lot of these data that he talked about. So if anybody was trying to frantically write down some of what he said, I believe it's available on your website, right? I mean, I've benefited greatly from that report. So I'm sure you can imagine, Ben gave you maybe a touch or a little bit of the flavor that our group probably went through. So I'm going to give you a little bit more. I think I want to start out by just saying that our group, I generally felt that the group did have a lot of the shared values, or we did have shared values around many of these issues. So the issue wasn't that some of us maybe felt like, oh, parents shouldn't be able to take time off. I think we all recognized and valued that parents and family members should be able to care for loved ones. It shouldn't be a matter of caring for loved ones or losing a job. So in general, we all came to the table with that understanding. Where the disagreements tended to come in was how effective can government be at providing leave to care for family members, and how effective can it be, and is it really the government's role? So I think that was where a lot of the disagreements came in, rather than any sort of value judgment about what families need. So I was one of the members of the group who could not quite get on board with a national policy around paid family care leave. And basically, my view came down to two main points. One was that even after all the discussions that we had and reviewing of the literature, I generally remained unconvinced that the types of policies that we had been talking about and that we're hearing about today would be effective in achieving the goals that we set out. And the second, and you heard this from Ben, was really a concern that any sort of government policy at the state or federal level would really end up just shifting benefits that are already provided from the private sector to the public sector. So I'm going to make 4 points that illustrates some of those positions a little bit more. The first one, as we heard from Ben, about 70% of those that take family care leave have indicated in survey data that they receive pay. It may not be called paid family care leave, but they do receive pay while they take leave. We don't know a whole lot about the other 30%. We don't know if that 30% experienced hardship, financial hardship, because they didn't get pay. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but we do not know that from existing data. We also don't know if family members that they indicated that they did not receive pay. We don't know if there were other care options. So just a lot of unknown about that other 30%. And of course, that doesn't account for those who were not able to take leave. As Ben also went through, there's some various estimates out there. I think in our report, we included some survey data that 10% on a survey indicated that they wanted to take family care leave and were not able to do so. To me, that's a fairly small percentage. But even if you believe that that's a large percentage, there's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the types of policies that we had been talking about would actually meet the need for that 10%. So in general, I think I heard from a number of my colleagues in some of our deliberations when we talked about these issues, a federal policy, it can't hurt. It's obviously not going to do harm to those 10%, or at least it's something. And for me, I just found some of those arguments to be rather unconvincing, because when you're talking about a very large federal program, I think we need more to go on than just it might be nice to have. The second point I want to make is there was quite a bit in the report about the aging population and the long-term care needs of our aging population. I have a lot of concerns about the long-term care needs and the aging population in this country. However, I don't believe that the types of policies that we're talking about, again, a time-limited benefit of even if it's 12 weeks, that will have really no impact on the type of long-term care needs that we're talking about. When you think about issues of dementia, those types of long-term care needs are not going to be solved by the type of paid leave policies we're talking about. And just to give you an idea, the chart was up there earlier, but other countries that provide paid family care leave, it's often for terminal illnesses or end-of-life care. It's not for the type of long-term care issues that were mentioned in the report. Third, and this is just related to the evidence, we talked about parental leave earlier. There's just much more evidence about the effectiveness of paid parental leave in terms of labor force participation, health outcomes, a number of things. That evidence base really is non-existent or very thin when it comes to family care leave. There's one study that we cited in the report about the state program in California, and it did find that the paid family care leave policy in California reduced nursing home costs, but it was for recuperation. It wasn't for the type of long-term care needs that really cost the most and would have the most impact on reduction of Medicare or Medicaid costs. So again, there's really just not a whole lot of evidence, and you'll see in the report there was really even at the international level, just no evidence really on the labor force participation issues as it relates to family care leave. So once you get a chance to look at the report, you'll see a lot of, well, family care leave could do this, or it might do this. It might increase labor force participation. It could do this. But again, we just really did not find the literature and the evidence to support that. And then finally, just the international comparison. So we often hear about parental leave, how the United States is the only country that does not have paid parental leave. And it's often used as a justification for why we should. But if you look at the international comparison for paid family care leave, there's about a third of OECD countries, at least, do not have any family care leave. So you almost wonder if that justification could also be used for family care leave. So if these other countries do not feel it's necessary to provide family care leave, why should the United States? And then just the other comparison for international, as we saw in the chart Aparna showed, again, it is a lot of times for terminal illnesses, end-of-life care, not for this broad category of family care. And to echo what Abby said earlier, there's just a lot of issues about how you define that, what it means, and what the length of time should be for those types of issues. So those were basically the things that factored into my decision making when we debated some of these things. So I just wanted to end, though, with three things that I would like to do, because even though I was unconvinced that at this time a federal policy was necessary for family care leave, again, I did feel that we shared a lot of the same values, and I don't want workers to have to choose between their job and their family either. So I would like to see more discussion about proposals that could possibly target the most vulnerable populations, so the low income that we saw some of the data earlier. That's the population that's less likely to already be receiving pay for leave, and also those that if they do have to leave the labor market for caring responsibilities are probably going to be the ones most vulnerable from a financial perspective. I'd also like to see more research when it comes to family care leave at the state level with the state programs, like we have for parental leave. I think that the data are there. We just need to have some researchers take a look at it. And then finally, I'd like to see more private sector solutions. We heard a lot about that there is coverage. Maybe there's opportunities for the private sector to expand paid time off more, make it more flexible for workers to bank time so that they can use it in case of family care needs. I think that there's more creativity that can happen in the private sector, and that government doesn't always have to be the solution.
Thank you. Over to Jane Waldfogel.
So I think today's giving you a really good flavor of the kind of conversations that we had in the working group and the kind of job that Aparna and Belle did actually in bringing us all together. I hope what you're hearing is the agreement on values.
You're a wonderful group of cats.
I haven't called us cats. I hope what you've heard is the agreement that we had on principles and values, and you'll find them in Chapter 3 of the report. So I'm really glad that Angela emphasized that. So we talked about principles like we agreed that we should try to limit hardship for families at their time of need, promote labor force attachment, health, gender neutrality, ensuring access to the least advantaged, principles around earned benefits and shared contributions, flexibility, simplicity, inclusiveness. And I think there was a lot of agreement that family care leave could meet those principles and values. I think the sticking points were, as Angela was saying, the question about cost effectiveness. Is this the most cost effective way to address these family care needs, about which we know much less than we know about parental leave or medical leave? And then there was also the concern, which I think you didn't flag so much, but maybe the first panel emphasized, around disruptive effects for employers. I think Abby mentioned that. I think actually Harry and Chris also mentioned that. So those are the principles. I mean, we want to do all these things for families and workers, but without unnecessarily disrupting employers and in a way that's cost effective. So I wanted to talk about what we know about the need for family care leave, the benefits and the costs, and how that relates to these principles. So first around the need, as you've heard, the need is low in any given year. because these things don't arise, thank God, they don't arise year in and year out. There is a small percentage of families that have family members with chronic conditions, so that need is going to arise year in, year out. Thankfully, that's fairly small. 15% of kids have a serious chronic health condition or disability. 25% of the workforce has a family member with a serious chronic health condition or disability. Those are relatively low shares, although they're not zero, 15, 25%. So those conditions may arise year in, year out. Thank God, the more acute illnesses arise less frequently. So relatively few workers take this kind of leave in any given year, about 2.5% in the 2012 FMLA survey, but the lifetime need is much higher. So in the Pew survey, 25%, a quarter of U.S. workers have ever taken leave to care for a seriously ill family member. Another quarter anticipate that they're going to have to sometime in the future. So that's half the workforce. So that's no longer a small number. So we've gone from 2.4% taking it in any given year to half the workforce has the need. So is the need low or high? It depends on which set of numbers you favor. Both sets of numbers are correct. They're both answers to that question. And then another, I mentioned the numbers who have chronic illnesses, and in addition to that, 15% of kids each year experience an acute illness or injury that requires them to stay home for at least a week. So that's another occasion when parents might need to take time off. Second, as was already mentioned, there's a significant unmet need which is substantially higher for disadvantaged families. So although only 1.8% of employees in the 2012 FMLA survey said they needed to take this kind of leave, but they couldn't take it, 10% of employees in the Pew survey said they needed it in the past 2 years and couldn't take it. And when you think about all kinds of family and medical leave, the need is much higher among low-income workers. Unmet need, 30% of low-income workers said they needed to take leave and they couldn't take it, versus only 14% of higher income workers. So those numbers kind of speak to, we've heard a lot about, well, among those who took leave, a lot of them got paid, but that doesn't tell us about those who didn't take leave and how many people are out there who needed to take leave who couldn't take it. And it sounds like among low-income workers, it's 30%, and even among higher income workers, it's 14%. So turning to the benefits of providing paid family care leave, health outcomes for family members are better when someone can take time off to help out with care. Families are less likely to experience financial hardship, things like borrowing money, using public assistance. Labor market and future economic outcomes are better if people can stay on the job rather than quitting work. Employers benefit from retaining experienced employees. It promotes simplicity, flexibility, inclusion, gender neutrality. So there's a host of benefits. Of course, there's also some costs. So as was mentioned in the first panel, anytime you have a benefit like this, you have to pay for it. So you'd have to raise taxes, things like payroll tax increases. That's real. If more paid leave is available, employees will take more leave. That's for sure. So if I'm arguing that there are some employees out there who have a need for leave for family care reasons who currently can't take it, either because they have no leave at all or no paid leave, then the flip side of that is if you offer the benefit, people will take it up. So there will be more leave taken, and people will take more leave and longer leaves, which could cause some disruption for employers. So that's real. So we've got to, we have to acknowledge that. And is that balanced out by what the benefits would be? But there are also cost savings. So employees would be less likely to claim means-tested benefits during leave if they got paid. The FMLA surveys consistently find that people who are on leave and who don't get paid turn to things like welfare benefits to cover their living expenses, or they borrow money, they go into debt. So those things would decline with paid leave. Employees would be less likely to quit work, leading to reduced turnover costs, increased revenues through increased tax payments, Social Security payments, fewer early Social Security claims. One of the things we know from the literature about family members who are working and have a family member with a disability or a chronic health condition, it's very hard to manage that without leave. And so often what happens is it becomes a kind of 0-1 situation where the employee just leaves the labor force. And there's quite a bit of evidence that people retire early, retire prematurely, because either they have a health condition or their partner or their parent has a health condition. That means somebody is no longer paying taxes, paying into Social Security, and is claiming their Social Security early. This is not to anybody's advantage, right? It's much better off if we can keep that person in the labor market. And as Angela mentioned, there is that one really interesting study from California finding that in the wake of California's paid family and medical leave law, there were reduced expenditures on nursing homes. And we think that the mechanism for that was a family member who, say, your mother falls, she breaks her hip, she needs recuperative care. Instead of going into a nursing home, if you can take some leave, you can help her manage that care at home. Admittedly, that's not managing care in the long run for the next 5 years, but it's saving government money and it's giving a better quality of care to that mother or care recipient. So it's definitely a benefit. So in terms of how paid family care leave would stack up against our principles, I think it actually stacks up quite well. The questions are about cost effectiveness, and the questions are about disruption for employers. But I think at the kind of durations that we're talking about 8 weeks total that you can take a year, if we sort of thought of it as being like what we'd endorse for parental leave. At fairly low replacement rates, with lots of verification as there is in the current state programs. I don't think the usage would be that extreme or that onerous for employers. So just to conclude, I'll conclude with 3 points. First, most workers will experience the need to provide family care at some point during their working life. But the use of family care leave in any given year is low. The fact that the use of care in any given year is low is actually a good thing. It means it's not very costly to these programs. Not very many people would take it in any given year. Second, including family care leave in a larger family and medical leave law makes a lot of sense in terms of most of the principles we've articulated. The sticking points are around disruptions for employers and cost effectiveness, and I don't think either of those are too difficult. And third, the best evidence from the FMLA and the state laws suggests that family care leave is rare and of short duration. So I think a properly specified law, a law that wasn't super generous, that had lots of verification, monitoring, not a very high replacement rate, could satisfy all of our principles. So and that's why I tried to fight really hard to keep talking about family care leave and not have it fall off the table. But it is a tough one. We know less about it than the other ones. And I have to say I've learned a ton in this process. I've been working on paid family and medical care leave for 25 years. And I've learned so much in the last year about this aspect of it, family care leave, because we do know less about that than about the other types. But having learned all this, I'm more persuaded than ever that we should be including it as part of a program.
I saw a lot of nodding at the end of the table here, so
Sorry.
Last but definitely not least, we're going to hear from Heather Bushey.
Thank you. And I want to start by thanking Bell and Aparna for your leadership in this effort. This has been, as Aparna noted in her opening remarks, we spent a lot more time than anticipated this year, and I really appreciate all the work you've done and what you've helped us all accomplish together. So thank you. So there were a lot of great points made up here. I want to focus on 3 specific points. And that is, they're all sort of about where I see the evidence. First is I think that we do see a lot of evidence that paid family leave works. We see a lot of evidence that there's a significant demand for this policy, and we see a lot of evidence of positive economic outcomes. And I want to start, I'm going to be focusing on the evidence throughout because I think that that's the conversation that this group was trying to have, that we did have, and I think that's a conversation we need to have here today, that what we should be doing is grounding our conversation about where to go forward on this policy in the evidence. So the first, to go to my first point, I think there is actually now very strong evidence that government can actually administer paid family leave effectively. There are 4 states where paid family leave has been in place for quite some time, one of them for 14 years, another one for 9. We actually know a lot. It is actually the case that now, once these new policies are in effect, over a quarter of the American people will be covered by this policy. These are new, universal, statewide policies funded by payroll taxes that are working. I'd like to take a poll. How many of you have ever read a newspaper article that has talked about a problem or a complaint about one of these policies? You can talk about that on your panel, Jeff. But I would like that for those of you looking online, only one person raised his hand. He's on the next panel. I'm very curious to hear what he has to say. The point being is that these policies have been in place for quite some time, and they've been effective. They've been effective at meeting demand, they have not destroyed economic outcomes, and they have not led to large negative outcry. And I think we need to start with that very real evidence in front of us. Yes. Now, I want to note, it was brought up on the first panel about these states. So the states that moved forward first on paid family leave were states that had these long-standing programs. And it'll be very interesting, and I think there's a lot to be learned, and we should study what's going to happen in these 3 new states, well, 2 states in the district, which of course is not a state, that will be implementing these programs over the next few years. So I agree that there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot to learn on how difficult it may be for a state to set up a brand new standalone program. I think the comments that were made earlier that Harry and others made about the administrative costs of setting up a new program versus tapping into what we already do is really important. But we do know that when states tap into an already existing administrative structure, it works and it's effective. So the next point that I want to make is around the evidence that these programs are popular. And here I want to emphasize that the momentum is behind comprehensive paid family and medical leave. That's what all these states have done. They haven't pulled them apart, they've done them together. So if we want to look at the evidence of what works, they've done parental, family, and added this on to individual medical leave. So thinking about what works and where the momentum is, I think that's an important thing to note. That's also where the American public is. A recent study by Pew finds that 2/3, 67% of Americans support paid family leave. A new survey by the National Partnership for Women and Families finds 8 out of 10 voters support a comprehensive national paid family and medical leave plan that covers everything covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act. Own illness, parental leave, family care. 8 out of 10. Republicans, 74% of Republicans polled said they want a comprehensive program. This is a bipartisan issue. And again, there's evidence that this is working out there in the states. Now, when we look again at the demand, one of the things that we see is that across all voters, and again, this is from the National Partnership's recent poll, across all voters, the most common reason given for potentially being helped by a national paid leave program is to care for an elderly, seriously ill, injured, or disabled family member, 65%, followed by own illness, 57%, followed by 39% new child. It's a little inconsistent with some of the numbers that we saw from someone else, and we should dig into that a little bit more, but there is recent evidence that family leave is where people think they're going to need it because, of course, we're living in an aging population. Now, the other thing that people are demanding is they're demanding to be given the option to pay for this. The National Partnership Survey shows that 84% of voters are willing to pay for this proposal, just like all the people in the states where we have this program, right? In the 4 states that implemented it early, this was fully funded by an increase in employee payroll taxes. And again, you did not see, the kind of blowback that one might expect given some of the fears that people have. Polls show that 7 in 10 would be willing to pay much more than actually what the program costs. The numbers are quite small. Somebody put up the panel looking at all the different programs. The highest ones cost a full percentage point of payroll taxes, but most of them are much lower. The next panel, you're going to see that it's somewhere around maybe 4/10 to 6/10 of a percentage point to implement this, along the lines of one model, which they'll talk about, so I don't want to get into those details. Distracting. So this is consistent with other research that has been done in recent years, where Americans are saying that they want to raise taxes for policies that actually provide public goods that we all benefit from. Where Americans are very frustrated is that they don't feel that the rich are paying their fair share. Some of this is from work by Vanessa Williamson, who I know works with Bell and others over at Brookings, who wrote a whole fantastic book on this. If you want to know more, talk to me after. And, we can also see this happening in other states across the country, that people are willing to pay taxes for things they value, like public schools. So the third point that I wanted to make is that the evidence is that these programs are good for the economy. And we've already heard a number of points here, so I don't want to spend too much of my time on this, but I want to emphasize that with an aging population, this is an especially important issue. More than 1 out of 6 workers are caregivers, and many of them, most of those people those workers are doing this in the way that Jane described. They're helping, they're maybe spending a day a week, a day a month, taking an ailing family to the doctor, and that these kinds of leaves can be very helpful for them. Research, of course, shows that those workers that don't have access to paid family leave or who are caregivers, not necessarily that they don't have access to paid family leave, really do suffer in terms of their labor force participation and labor market outcomes. The study that has already been cited about the study from the University of Iowa's Kanika Arora and Syracuse's Douglas Wolfe that has already been mentioned about nursing homes is a really important one, and I want to emphasize that this is sort of the cutting edge of where the research is. We at Equitable Growth are actually looking to be funding and working with scholars who are interested in doing more of this research. But, the idea that the decrease of 11%, which is a very big decline in the share of elderly residing in nursing homes, this is an important study. It was a well-done, well-crafted study, and this can also help limit the long-term need for care, because we know that people get good care when they first get sick, are less likely to go back, cycle back in and out of hospitals. We also have evidence from a 2016 Department of Labor study on California that compared with workers taking paid parental leave. So compared with workers taking parental leave, workers taking leave for family caregiving needs for an ill family member had a greater attachment to the labor force both before and after their claim. So this is important evidence that we have from the states, the laboratories of democracy, and they are showing that these policies can be effectively implemented and that they can have positive economic outcomes and that they're meeting an unfilled at the federal level need from the public. Now, in closing, I want to make 2 comments. So first, and I've kind of already noted this a little bit, most, and it's already been talked about, most of the program evaluation on paid leave programs is on paid maternity leave. There is a large literature on the effects of unpaid and paid leave and what women do when they have children. There's far less on fathers. There's not as much, certainly, on family care leave. So this is definitely an area where we need to do more. We do have these states that have had these programs in place for decades, and again, at Equitable Growth, we are looking for scholars who are eager to work with us to investigate what we can learn from that. But we already have them in place. We already can learn a lot about what these programs can do because they're already out there. So there is solid evidence from the states who've implemented these comprehensive programs. Every one of the programs in the states is effectively matching revenues to costs. They are all funded through modest payroll taxes. None have been the focus of rollbacks, investigations, or misuse, or a source of financial hardship for lower wage workers or small businesses. And that is why we are seeing so much momentum behind these comprehensive policies at the state level. At least 19 states have proposed legislation to establish paid family leave programs in 2017. 10 states are currently provide it for state employees. Arkansas passed a measure to do so last year, and similar measures were proposed in at least 6 other states. This is actually, I think you wouldn't understand if you just were listening up until now. I think that this is actually already happening out there in the country, and we're behind at the federal level, and this conversation isn't meeting where the evidence and the momentum actually is. Now, it was exciting to participate in this working group. Everyone agreed that we need to be supporting a strong economy, that we needed to be supporting families. Everyone agreed about the importance of evidence. And we have that evidence. We know how to create a program that builds a strong economy and supports families. I'm going to end on one final point, which is that one of the lessons that we've learned from the fights for these policies over the years and what we've learned from the passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act is that having it as a comprehensive policy was what made the difference between it passing and not, because it allowed people to create a strong coalition between parents and organizations that focus on small children and people who care about the disabled and people who care about the elderly, and pull it all together. So you had a broad, large coalition. It makes it easier for employers to implement because the policy isn't just given for one kind of family need, but it's for all kinds. And all of there is so much research and evidence on how to make these policies work in the workplace, and the bad way to do it is to just say, oh, only that kind of person gets leave. It creates resentment. It's not good management. And that is why when they did the Family and Medical Leave Act, they put these all together. Creates this kind of strong coalition that's actually going to get this passed. And again, we've seen that time and time and time again out in the States. And it creates that equity within the workplace that makes this policy easier for employers to implement.
Terrific. I think this should give all of you a lot of the flavor of what our conversations have been like and how knowledgeable this group is and how intensely they feel about some of these issues, but in a really well-informed and sensible way, which I'm just very, very proud of all of them. People keep thanking Aparna and I. All we did was make room for the cats to come together, and they've been terrific. So looking at the time and thinking maybe, although I do have a couple of questions, that if there are questions from the audience, I want to go to those first because you haven't had much chance to get in here. Anybody want to ask a question? Yes, right here. Tell us who you are first.
Hi, thank you. My name is Patrice Nwuka with the Independent Women's Forum. I have a comment and a question. So first, I really want to give a shout out to Abby for mentioning Marco Rubio's bill that he introduced. It's actually based on an idea from one of our scholars on using Social Security as a conservative means to providing paid leave. Really, my question is about the political realities of any of these proposals. You're talking, I love the mention of the Pew studies around polling right now, where obviously a lot of Americans agree that we need some sort of maternity leave. When you dig a little bit deeper into Pew, they actually look at where Americans believe who should be paying for it, and it's actually not a silver bullet that it should be government. So most people actually do think it should be through the private sector. So I think that there's still room for discussion about who should be providing it. Given, though, that if we want to say, okay, well, government can play a role, we have a proposal that suggests that government can play somewhat of a role, what are the political realities of your ideas here versus something like Marco Rubio's bill, which is crafted by conservatives, could actually get some momentum and has potentially some White House support behind this, Republicans versus just Democrats who are not in power right now, and most Americans who will not potentially vote for something like the Family Leave Act?
That's a really excellent question. Anybody want to respond to it?
Well, I'll just quickly say, I mean, obviously the political reality, well, there's a lot of times not a whole lot of political reality for many of the policies that we're talking about, which we all expressed a lot of frustration in some of our deliberations. I'm going to play the naive researcher for a minute and suggest that I think the reason there has been a little bit of a change in parental leave and support for parental leave at the policymaker level is because we do have some evidence that it has these positive effects on labor force participation and especially on the health and well-being of mothers and children. I really appreciate Heather's passion about this, but I think everything Heather said and what I said, it actually was not contradictory. I 100% agree that states and even the federal government could effectively implement these policies. I have no doubt. I worked for a state for about a decade. I know government knows how to implement programs. My concern is should they be, and how effective are these programs in actually achieving the outcomes that we want? And what we both acknowledged is that we don't have a lot of evidence for family care leave and even medical care leave on how it affects labor force participation, and very limited on how it affects health. So I think that maybe in terms of political reality, if we can get a slightly larger evidence base that these policies are effective, we might see, again, over time, and it'll take a lot of work, but we might start to see a little bit more of a shift on some of these other policies. If the evidence is there, which it may not be, but if it is there, then I think it could maybe follow a similar path to what we saw on parental leave.
Any other questions, comments? All right, I think maybe we've got quite a few steps to go here, and so I think I want to thank this panel very, very much for their terrific remarks, and move on to the next one.
Who's going first? Let's just give it a 2-minute break. I think people. Let's just give it a 2-minute break. We'll take a 2-minute break if you want to get coffee and then recharge for the modeling presentation. Do you want me to ask you about that? Or
What?
about the problems with the family care leave?
My answer is,
Yeah.
ill-defined Google alerts.
Exactly.
Which I can tell Heather, it's just ill-defined Google alerts.
Thank you. 15 seconds. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I hope we're coordinated. I might leave lots of time for demonstration, question, and answer. Because we haven't really coordinated very precisely about where he's going to stop by and start. So.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. You go ahead. Okay. I'm just hoping I have something to say after that. Okay. Great.
Are there any questions you want me to ask? Because I wasn't planning to, and I was just going to turn up to.
So,
Yeah.
you might by the time I'm done.
Yeah.
Could you clarify what you meant? We kept it really short on the slides.
That's good.
And the demonstrations in the slide. So, but they're, so.
It's only 20 minutes, so it's not a big panel.
That's what I mean with the demonstration, the switch over
Yeah.
and stuff.
Okay.
Ben's been here and I'm not. They should have given us to us when we sat down. We could be responsible.
So do you want yours here? You can remove it because we have Bell. Yeah.
Okay, so should we start early?
1. We can.
It's
Yeah.
45. It's supposed to.
Yeah. I'll call everybody back.
Okay, sounds good.
most
I
extreme.
appreciate the shout outs from everybody. God, the pressure is going.
Okay, we're going to start with the modeling presentation. So if you could all take your seats, please. We have Ben from the American Action Forum and Jeff Hayes from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And we do view this as a big contribution of the group and in particular of the modelers. Sarah Jane Glynn is not here with us today, but Ben, Jeff, and Sarah have really sort of carried the weight of this work for us. And our motivation for looking into the cost modeling was that, a lot of times when you look at what a paid leave legislative or bill is likely to cost, you get these often very, widely differing estimates by hundreds of billions of dollars on what a paid leave policy would look like. And so we sort of managed to tap into the people who were actually behind the scenes, who were doing the modeling of these cost estimates of these bills, and we said, would you be willing to come together and work together and produce a sort of a paper for everyone to understand just what exactly goes into the modeling, why the numbers look so different. And we were very fortunate to have Ben and Jeff and Sarah work together. The paper is part of the report that you have there, but we've also produced an online model which allows you to punch in some numbers, about the design of the policy, what duration it is, what wage replacement we're getting, etc. That will give you a cost estimate easily. So it's just a very simple online tool that Ben is going to talk about. But with that said, I'm going to turn over to Ben and Jeff and look forward to your questions at the end.
All right. Well, I'm Ben Giddes. Sorry you have to put up with me for a few more minutes. But I worked with Jeff and Sarah Jane Glynn on estimating the cost of paid family leave benefits. And really, the working group in Parna and Bell, they posed a challenge to us. They noted that each of us individually has performed cost estimates of the same proposals, but come to pretty different conclusions about the bottom line cost. For instance, with the Family Act, which is Senator Gillibrand's proposal, I've estimated that it could cost about $80 billion a year, whereas Sarah Jane and Jeff have had estimates that are closer to around $30 billion a year. So the challenge was for us to figure out what's driving the differences and see if we can come to a better understanding. And so to do this, we decided to model a hypothetical paid family and medical leave program, and we made decisions about the parameters to keep it as simple as possible so we could better understand what methodological choices are we making that are driving these differences. And so what we modeled was similar parameters as the paid parental leave program that this working group proposed last year, plus medical leave and family care leave, which would also be included in this program. And so it would replace 70% of usual weekly earnings up to a maximum of $600 per week. And it would provide the benefits for up to 8 weeks per year. The benefits would be universally available to any worker, as again, another a decision to keep it simple. And there would be no waiting period. So pretty much any worker who is employed would be eligible for this benefit. And of course, no actual proposal has those parameters, which is important to mention. So to test the differences, we employed three different methodological strategies. So what you see here is assuming that program use would mirror the experience of family leave taking under the Family and Medical Leave Act nationally. And the benefit to this approach is simply that the data represents the population of folks who would likely be eligible for this federal program. And the FMLA is the only federal program we have that guarantees some form of family leave, although it does not guarantee any pay. The second approach we used was assuming that the program use would be similar to what has occurred in states with paid family leave programs, specifically California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And the advantage of that approach is that the programs themselves are more closely resemble this hypothetical program that we are modeling. And then the third method is a simulation model that Jeff has developed at Institute for Women's and Policy Research. And he runs two different simulations with it. It uses the same FMLA data that is used in Method A. In the first simulation, it incorporates assumptions that regarding take-up that would make it more similar to the state experience. And then in the second simulation, he incorporates assumptions that are more in line with what has occurred under the FMLA. And so these are the numbers that we came to. As you can see, there's a pretty wide range of numbers here. The column A is assuming FMLA use, and that is the total cost comes to $46 billion. And at the other end of the spectrum, Method B, assuming state usage, and specifically with New Jersey, the total cost comes out to $7.6 billion. And you can see that under both, and across all the different methods used here, there is a consistent pattern that medical leave is by far the most expensive form, and it's primarily because under each one it is the most commonly used. And I also want to note that the differences between Method A and Method B are driven mostly due to different assumptions about take-up. Method A assumes the take-up what it was under the FMLA, which is around 16% of workers, while Method B under New Jersey is only about 4%. And then I'll have Jeff take it from here to talk about the simulation model and what we can learn from these estimates.
Good afternoon. I have first time at the podium, so I get to thank Aparna and Bell for convening us and for all the colleagues that were on the panel for the year. I only joined in the second year. But I'd also like to thank their research assistants, past and present, because they have had excellent help who have seriously been sent into the fields to herd the cats. So as Ben said, I was part of the task was, because IWPR has developed over the last 15, 20 years, the simulation model with Randy Albelda at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Alan Clayton Matthews, who's now at Northeastern. We've been developing this model. We've had, the funding has come and gone and stuff as these things happen. We've recently had some funding through the Women's Bureau paid leave grant programs and other departments at DOL to keep improving it and to try to keep it updated. And but as a simulation model, it is sort of a black box, a closed system. It's opaque. It's not transparent. So Ben's method is sort of, again, the transparent. What if what if everyone took their FMLA leaves and received benefits for them? What would things cost? So it's realistic assumptions. It's not the high. It's not the ceiling. It's not what the sort of maximum that benefits could be, but it's the realistic assumptions about what leaves have been taken in 2012 and applied to the current labor force. Sarah Jane started with what's the state programs. We don't quite know why the state programs don't have the take-up of. You talk about the place where we don't have a lot of information. We don't have we don't know a lot about why people aren't using the state programs. California's done some research and found very low awareness. The benefit levels in California had been low. They are up a bit this year, but and so low-wage workers might not be able to take them. They might not have job protection. California strictly has their federal and state FMLA protections. It's know, and so we don't know exactly why people aren't using the programs. And so the take-up rates are pretty key to this. So I was sort of tasked with trying to show whether this simulation model, while it's opaque and not transparent, whether it can be flexible and nimble and try to like hit the other two. And so while the New Jersey here from the estimates on B, that was the low one of the three. When you look at the report, you'll see. Bell earlier showed the middle was California, which is about twice that. And then the high was Rhode Island, which has quite, on paper, has quite high take-up and usage. And again, there's not a lot of really understanding across those three as to why that might be. But the Rhode Island take-up rate comes out a little bit lower than the method C for the state level estimates. And whereas, again, the simulation model for the method A, mimicking the model A, came out just a little bit lower. So again, we thought it came out pretty good. The simulation model, again, is based on the same data that Ben's using for the take-up rates. I mean, it's the 2012 FMLA survey data. It makes some different assumptions along the way. It does check whether the leaves required hospitalization or medical attention. So it would take out some of the own health leaves. It does, some other things like that. But it is basically fundamentally then the same data. As, so if you say that everyone's going to claim their benefits in the simulation model, you can get out similar results here. And so we thought that was a nice, proof of the simulation model's effectiveness. But again, as Ben said, then the bulk of over half the leaves are for own health under all the models. These are just the method B, New Jersey, and the method A. The method C's fell in the middle there, sort of for how many were own health and the child. And so that is the healthcare, the medical needs are important, and they're a big part of this discussion. Again, the family caregiving is a quarter at most, possibly as low as 4% of the leaves taken. Then when you look at the cost, you'll see they do not cost that much. Again, it's a question of the cost and the benefits, and I'm all on board with trying to help improve the evidence base there. We thought that while the magnitude estimates differed, that the methods outlined did have similarities. We found that personal medical leaves are the most going to cost the most in terms of the absolute share of the dollars spent. The parental and family caregiving would be less. They produce different usage levels and cost levels for the parental leaves. But I think some of this also comes out of the fact that when you compare, like, again, the method B, while Ben and I sort of started with no eligibility requirements imposed by the state and no waiting periods, the state programs that Sarah Jane was starting with have those implicitly built into the numerator for where she estimated her take-up rates. And so that's going to be one place that the differences did work in, but we tried our best to get things similar. So the range is substantially narrower than other estimates have been, and we think there's some room to keep building on this and working. And it's, again, it was a left-right continuum group, and so it was nice to, build the bonds across the groups in that way too and stuff. So, so thank you. And Ben is now going to demonstrate his tool that he helped put together for online calculation of costs.
Okay, so it'll take a few seconds for the tool here to load, but I worked with AEI on developing this online graphic that you could use to set parameters of a paid leave program and make assumptions about take-up, and then it would give you a cost for that program. And so essentially, here we go. Essentially, the two fundamental things to think about when, sorry, let me get this right. All right, here we are. This is it. There's two fundamental things that we outline in this tool that impact the bottom line cost of the program. First, it's the program parameters, and you'll be able to set, I think, 6 different parameters here. It's the type of leave covered, if you want to do family care, parental, medical, or all 3. Just to demonstrate the hypothetical program Jeff and I demonstrated, I'm going to do that one. So picking all 3 and doing for 8 weeks maximum duration, and a wage replacement rate of 70% with, I'm sure I'm seeing this right. Ooh. With a maximum benefit of $600, no waiting period, no work requirement. And so if you wanted to model with so that those are setting the parameters. This last step is setting the assumption about take-up. So there are essentially 2 fundamental assumptions that Jeff and I identified that drove the differences between FMLA use and state program use. The first was state program take-up. Of those who are eligible, how many are actually going to claim the benefit when they take leave? And the second is, what is the employer response? How often are employers going to offer their own benefit before folks actually claim the state program? So under the FMLA experience, this is modeling the first upper end estimate you saw earlier. Click calculate, and you get an estimate pretty close to what we saw earlier, around $50 billion for the cost of that program. And the estimate, it's a little different because it's based on a different employment population estimate, so it's a little higher, but it's right in the range. If you want to reduce the the worker take-up, so it's more similar to what has occurred in the States, you can see how individually how each of these assumptions drives the difference. So state program take-up, change it to that. Hit calculate, and you get a number that is somewhat smaller, brings it down to about $28 billion. You can also see how the other assumption by itself makes a difference in the cost estimate. State program employer response. This essentially assumes that workers who are offered paid leave from their employer, 60% of them will use the employer benefit for their first 4 weeks of leave and then move on to the federal program. Hit calculate, and we are a little higher because that assumption does not make as big of a difference as the take-up assumption. So we're back up to $39 billion. So this last button is essentially combining those 2 assumptions. It's the complete state program experience. And we are at about $22 billion, which is fairly similar to the lower end that Jeff provided for us in the presentation. And so I'm pretty excited about this. Sorry that technically it's kind of difficult to actually demonstrate it from here, but I think this could be pretty useful for folks when considering different types of programs they want to propose. When you want a shorter duration, more generous benefit, more generous maximum benefit, I think can be pretty insightful for those who are making those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben and Jeff. I think this is a hugely valuable contribution to policymakers. I think getting modelers on the same page and providing a tool for people to analyze just what a policy could cost. And what you see there is the payroll cost, which is what's often debated in media. What is this going to cost the average employee or the average employer in terms of a payroll tax hike? Do you think the biggest differences between your models were on the assumptions about take-up, or?
So yeah, yes. The biggest difference is the assumption of what is the policy we're basing this off of. Is it the experience in the states, or is it the experience federally? Jeff's model somewhat combines that, but it tries to incorporate the experiences in the states while using the federal data. But those are important questions that I don't think either of us really know the answer to.
That's right.
The other piece is that they were based on the worker survey from the FMLA.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the idea is that they're all very worker-centric. Some of the questions that have been raised is about what our employer response is going to be if we implement a program, things like that. And that's another place where there would be more variation. None of these have done a huge job on that. It's a pretty rudimentary piece in the simulation model that does allow people who would be offered full benefits from their employer, under current law, to receive the benefit and then have their employer top up. And so it's a fairly limited range of employer options that we were able to work in so far. But given that this worker-centric, what do workers take and what would the cost to pay them?
Right, and it is obviously something very tough to model because a federal policy could look very different, and awareness, as you said, about the policy could be very different. And so, we don't even know if the state programs are sort of the ideal way to model this, right? Or even the FMLA is the ideal way to model it because it's not paid.
Based on our group discussions, I did sort of, what I would say, goose up the claiming rates in the simulation model, and they are much more close to Rhode Island, and the results come out much more closely to the Rhode Island estimates from Sarah Jane, because again, we did boost the take up on that assumption that awareness would be easier and things like that.
Okay, great. Anything else you want to add before we turn over?
I think just it's important to add, and I've mentioned this before, one of the reasons there's a wide range also is simply we don't know a whole lot. And Jeff highlighted a lot of questions we still have about state programs. I've earlier today highlighted a lot of questions we have about what's going on in the private sector. And so that's one of the important things that's driving this difference.
That's right. Okay, so any questions? Yeah, let's start here.
Hi, there we go. Hi, I'm Amanda Lenhart from the Better Life Lab, and I really love the simulation and the model and the opportunity for people to get engaged with it. I wonder, is there a place for those of us who are interested where we can go and see a little bit more about some of the assumptions around state? Like, what are the percentages that you're assuming of uptake for the different models in the very bottom? Is there a place where we could kind of click through to find that, or maybe that's something you could add onto the buttons?
Well, there is an open source web page on GitHub. Okay. Anybody can take a look at the technical details. Okay. Otherwise, there is nothing on the tool where we can, the outputs aren't how many folks are taking the benefit or how long they're taking it for it. That's all built into how the numbers get there. But if you want to take a look at the report that Jeff, Sarah Jane, and I looked at, we do, for each of the strategies we examined, provide how many estimated take-up, estimated duration, estimated average weekly benefit, that type of information. Okay.
Yeah, so it's all, so their paper is also in the report at the end. Okay. And so you can get a very good sense of just, what assumptions are being made and why the numbers look different.
Great. And one other question, is there any possibility of adding in an opportunity to create a population size? Because I'm thinking we know a lot of the work is happening on the state level. And if let's say I'm a state lawmaker, I'm thinking about writing a policy or a new law, it might be fun for me to come here and be able to put in the size of my own state and see what some of the costs might be for me. So I don't know if that's something you might be able to add.
Well, that would be interesting. Yeah. That's kind of up to
And we are going to, we hope to expand upon this tool as we get more questions about, what else can we do with this. We're absolutely open to the idea of expanding this, conditional on Ben and Jeff being involved. But that's a good question. Anybody else? Yes, Vicky.
Hi, Vicki Shabo from the National Partnership for Women and Families, and thank you for this work and for the work of the group. I have a one comment and I guess a question as well. So the comment is, even the range of these payroll deductions are very, very small.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions that always arises is, are workers willing to pay for this? Are people willing to pay for it? The percentages, even in the uppermost bound, are quite small. They're the same size or smaller than what the states have. And Heather mentioned our new polling, where we were able to confirm something we've seen in other polling, which is that people are willing to pay, and they're often willing to pay far more than these programs cost. So we asked about multiple ranges, up to a 5% payroll deduction, and a surprising number of people, 80%, are willing to pay at least 1 cent, basically, and that's true across party lines. So I often think that we confine ourselves to this conversation about austerity, and that's not where the public is, because they are so desirous of a policy like this and feel the need for a policy. And by the way, on family care, this is something that people want, and there tends to be a lot of backlash when you just talk about parental leave. So I think we also need to get out of the box of thinking about parental leave as the most popular piece, and actually think about, if you're creating a payroll tax system, that it actually makes sense to include everybody who might need the policy. And then I have a technical question, which is, how finely were you able to think about type of leave by gender and by duration and income level in building out this model, so that, to Amanda's point, if you're trying to simulate it to other populations, how much you could change the dials for a different population that you might be trying to model?
Well, so in the FMLA data, all that information is incorporated into the estimates. We don't have dials in this tool to figure out how much it costs for a specific demographic group. But that would also be an interesting thing to add.
But, do you mean that because you don't want the policy to be gender neutral? Like, why would you be interested in?
To figure out how finely the how finely the cost estimates match for different populations for different people, or thinking about employer, for the small share.
I see.
Argue do have meaningful paid family leave, how much you're able to adjust the model, and how much the model actually incorporates, income distributions and all of the pieces that you would want for a true.
Okay, yeah. And on your earlier question, Vicky, that is the whole point of the modeling, to get people aware of just what does it actually cost, and to get people on the same page about that, and hopefully spur that conversation about how, large can we make this and still not be talking about a huge payroll tax or, something else. Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you, Ben and Jeff, and we're going to turn over to our last panel. But thank you so much for your work.
Well, I know it's been a long day, and you all have been remarkably patient, but I hope it's been worthwhile. Let me once more advertise our report. There is an entire paper on the modeling that you just heard about, so if you want to read more details of what Ben and Jeff talked about, it is in the report. In addition, we commissioned 2 more broad gauged efforts to think about the future of social insurance in the United States from 2 groups. One was Doug Holtz-Aiken, and he wrote his paper with Ben Gittes again, and that paper is in the report. And the second paper on the future of social insurance was by Elizabeth Jacobs and Heather Boucher. I never know how to say Heather's last name. Boucher, okay. Sorry about that. The good news is she left. Yes, right. Anyway, Elizabeth is at the Center for Equitable Growth along with Heather, and they wrote the paper together. I asked both of them to really think about whether, for the future, thinking about all of the changes that have occurred in the economy and in the demographic composition of the workforce and in the nature of work itself, do we need to rethink or update or modernize our social insurance system? So that was sort of the question that was posed to both of them. They both wrote very thoughtful, well-researched papers, and we commend them to all of your attention. If I could take a moment to advertise my own effort in this area, I have a book coming out this month called The Forgotten Americans, and in it there's a chapter where I personally tried to answer this question. My personal answer is not the same that the working group would take, but I commend it to you if you're interested in these issues. Now, they came out with quite different approaches. I think Elizabeth and Heather were more interested in the whole notion of a social insurance program for paid leave purposes and for other purposes, whereas I think Doug and Ben were a little more interested in the idea of self-insurance. But I find their proposal very interesting because in addition to there being some self-insurance involved, they also recognize that low-income families might need some assistance from the federal government. And I was looking at the paper again last night and recognizing that your definition of low income is less than 325% of the poverty level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty high level. I mean, that takes you up to the middle class.
I'll take it down if you want.
Yeah. No, that's all right, Doug. I'll take what I can get from you. So, no, please. But really, these are interesting papers. So without further ado, let me ask each of you, let's start with you, Elizabeth, to say a little bit more about your paper.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Bella and Aparna, who've been thanked many times over, but they deserve it. I keep on trying to think of another animal other than cats, because I'm a dog person. But
how about lions?
Lions, yeah. Wild animals of some sort. But they did do a fantastic job. I know many people have said how much they learned through this process, and I would count myself amongst them. It's unusual, particularly in this political climate, to be able to think hard about important policy issues with a group of people where there's actual genuine disagreement but shared values. And so I really appreciate the work that they did in creating that space. And I also just want to take a moment also to thank those of you who are here and on the web. I know it's been a long afternoon, and so thank you for sticking around. And I know there are many people in the room who've worked on these issues for a long time, both from a research and advocacy policy perspective. And I just want to acknowledge that because there's a lot of wisdom in the room, in addition to the folks who've been up here. So to say a little bit about the paper, I mean, we were so glad to have the opportunity to take a step back from the specifics of paid leave to really think more broadly about social insurance. And I would take it even a step further back from that and say that my starting place is thinking about economic risk and what that means for American families, for American households. And our real starting place, the problem that we were trying to address, is thinking about how risk for American households has changed, how it's changed in the 80-plus years since we set up the basic systems for insuring against those risks, Social Security, for example, and really trying to think about looking ahead based on what we know and what we think we might know, what we should be doing about that. So just some quick background on the risk thing, which we haven't actually talked about, and some of this has to do with paid leave. Some of this it's a bigger picture. But I think it's worth putting out there that we know that household incomes are increasingly volatile for working families. The risk of a 50% drop over a 2-year period for a household has doubled since 1970. Year-to-year swings are higher, and this isn't just a problem for poor people. We've heard some about kind of targeting, but we know this is for everyone. There's a recent study that's showing that even people with moderate household household incomes, when you look at their month-to-month swings, they have an average of 2.5 months a year where their incomes are 25% below their annual average income. So that's sort of a quick and dirty taste of what the average American's family life looks like, right? Which is a pretty volatile existence. And so that was really where Heather and I started in thinking about this and trying to think about what we could be doing in terms of a social insurance system that might help tackle that. Now, as people have said before, part of what's going on is the fact that there is no longer someone at home to deal with all of the care responsibilities that happen. For many people, that's been the case. We've had two-parent working families in certain sectors of the economy for a long, long time, but increasingly that's the norm for a whole bunch of reasons. Caregiving needs don't go away just because somebody is at work. And the existing risk mitigation options for that aren't working, both for what we know in terms of paid leave and caregiving responsibilities, but I would argue because of what we see in terms of household income volatility, it goes beyond the care conversation. That's beyond the scope of the room, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is part of a broader kind of puzzle for how we deal with risk to household incomes in America today. We know that the private solutions aren't working. Both market-based commercial insurance and personal savings don't really cut it. People have insufficient incomes to really be saving. There's all kinds of stats that, most people don't have $400 in the bank to actually save. One could make an economic argument that we actually don't even really want them to because we talk about wanting people to consume. That's another separate conversation. On top of that, we know that people are myopic. We've learned a huge amount from behavioral economics about how hard it is to get people to save. And so actually just sort of putting this responsibility on people's shoulders without some help, I think is short-sighted and unlikely to be particularly successful. And that's what we've seen in terms of asking people to sort of self-insure. Employer-based solutions are also insufficient. Changing employment relationships mean that incentive for employers to kind of take care of their workers isn't there anymore. The ability for workers to actually contribute and accrue benefits isn't necessarily there. Increasingly, people bounce around from employer to employer. The structure of work has changed such that people don't even necessarily know who their main employer is in some cases, and we have more and more 1099 gig economy workers. Again, long conversation we could have about the scope of that and what that means, but I think it's safe to say that the employment relationships in the U.S. are changing. They have already changed in ways that too many people aren't covered by our existing systems that count on employers to offer benefits. We also know that employer-based systems create incentives to discriminate against those perceived as most likely to actually need the benefits. Younger women, for example, and I think also older workers potentially. There's the potential to see that going forward. And lastly, we know from health insurance that having employer-based benefits can create job lock, which is bad for the economy. It's bad for workers. We're in the middle of trying to reform our healthcare system to actually get away from employment-based insurance. So it seems kind of crazy to me to think hard about how do we create a new system looking forward that's actually recreating some of the very problems that we're trying to get away from in existing systems. And then lastly, the existing social insurance system obviously doesn't cover a lot of the new risks. We've talked about SSDI and TDI with their exceptions in their own way, but there are big gaps in terms of what we actually cover. So this landed us in a sort of social insurance model. If we know that self-insurance, expecting individuals to insure, has all kinds of issues, asking employers to voluntarily provide benefits or providing tax incentives for benefits is potentially full of issues. That sort of landed us with social insurance as potentially the best solution for actually working to update and help households better manage the risks that they face in today's economy. We know from both the modeling that we've just seen and from what's happening in the states that it's possible. We can responsibly fund a social insurance program. It can actually cover, in what we've been talking about today, parental, medical, and care-based leave. California set a precedent now almost 2 decades ago, and other states are following it. We don't have any states who have set up their own program that haven't actually decided to go with a social insurance-based model. One could argue that that's because states aren't particularly creative. One could also argue that they've seen that it works, and we like to do what works and then learn from it. So why go with this route? I would argue, at some point somebody here flagged the fact that we had general agreement in the working group on principles, but a disagreement over the role of government. I would argue that in many ways, social insurance is government facilitating people taking their responsibility for themselves, right? Because these are payroll tax funded programs. All of the models that you've seen, all of the state models and the modeling that you've seen has all been funded through a payroll tax. It mainly falls on employees, mainly because if you put it on employers, most economists believe that just ends up showing up in employees' wages anyway. So it really is kind of a forced savings mechanism. If you want to think about social insurance as a way of fostering personal responsibility, I would argue that if that's something that matters to you, and it certainly matters to me, that social insurance is actually very much about that. It's government providing a facilitating role for doing that. And doing social insurance that would actually expand to cover some of these caregiving-based risks that we've seen is part of a probably longer process of updating the social contract to reflect today's realities and avoiding some of the pitfalls of both the employer-based and individual-based approaches that we've seen before. We have a few basic principles at the end of the paper, many of which we've kind of talked about today and are in our broader report. It should be inclusive. There are political and economic reasons, so it should cover parental, medical, and care-based leave. It should be gender neutral for a whole host of reasons. And it should be a future-oriented program looking at the way that employment structures are designed. It shouldn't be based on tenure with a given employer. It should be based on an earnings history. I think that'll allow it to adapt much more flexibly to what may or may not happen in the workforce going forward. It turns it into a portable benefit as opposed to something that kind of through the back door ends up tied to a particular employer. It could be contribution-based, and I think all of these things are pretty key for thinking about how we go forward. I know that Doug, after me, is going to talk about how this is all expensive and how Social Security actually is a system built on straws that's about to collapse and has created more risk, if you've read his paper already. That is what it will say. So I will.
And remarkably enough, I'll say the same thing.
Yeah, I imagine that he will say the same thing. But I would counter, just to kind of to wrap up, that I think based on what we've seen so far in terms of the modeling that we've seen around this specific program, that it seems fairly tenable. I think there are some questions about startup costs, and I think we'll see what happens in Washington State and Massachusetts and DC that are trying to figure out how to do this, because you need to pre-fund the program in order to pay for people who need it now. But I do think that it's pretty possible that this can fairly easily pay for itself going forward and won't face the same risks as something like Social Security or Medicare or even SSDI, because of the intermittency and the small bits of leave. Social Security is something that people turn 65 and they collect for the rest of their lives. Parental leave, caregiving leave, medical leave is something that's time limited and relatively short, and not everyone will use it eventually. So I do think that some of the completely legitimate concerns that Doug and others who worry about fiscal responsibility point towards are potentially less of a concern in this context, exactly because of the risks that you're insuring against. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you. I forgot to introduce Doug, probably because I assume everybody knows Doug Holtz-Aiken, but let me remedy that and say that he is the president of the, or executive director, what do you call yours? President of the American Action Forum, which I think he started.
Yes.
I was also reminded, looking at his bio, that he was the top economic advisor during the presidential campaign of John McCain. And so I want to just express my own feelings of great regret and honor for Senator McCain since all of this has happened so recently. And so
that was unfair.
Doug, sorry, Doug. If you want to say anything about it, please do. Over to you, Doug.
I've talked a lot about John McCain for the past week and a half. I'll avoid another tear-jerking moment and just say it was a great privilege in my life to work with the senator. So let me start in the same place as Elizabeth in two ways. First, with the group. This really was a group with very different views. I mean, it ranged from cranky old male conservatives like me, op-ed writers in the New York Times, those kind of people, to Elizabeth, young, thoughtful, progressive types. It's an enormous range. And I think Bell and Aparna did more than herd ocelots or whatever we're on at this point. They fostered an environment where we could learn a lot from each other, and did. And so while it was, in my view, irritating and frustrating and sometimes outright painful, it was also remarkably productive and useful. And I thank them for that. Second place I want to sort of start out agreeing with Elizabeth is people value insurance against these economic risks. They do. And that's at the core of the need to meet those needs. And one of the things you heard, I hope, again and again, was that we all agree on that. That's a central piece of how you should think about the architecture of the economy and think about the policies that support it well, is meeting those insurance needs, whether it's insurance against living too long, running out of money, being poor in old age, or having poor health in old age, which is why we have a Medicare program, or being low income and having a bad health outcome, which is why we have a Medicaid program, or, in this case, insurance against the demands on your financial resources because of the need to take time off work and being unable to replace that in other ways. Those are genuine, deep needs in the economy, and they need to be met. Now, I spent 20 years as a college professor, and I was a public finance specialist and taught social insurance a million times. And the thing that led me to write the paper I did was there seemed to be an enormous gap in performance between what I taught and what I've experienced in the past 15 years as an element of the policy community. The structure of those programs is basically pretty similar, which is they're universal and mandatory, financed by a payroll tax, and getting a benefit determined by some schedule of eligibility and other characteristics of the income or household, depending on how it's done. And when you look at those programs, they don't seem to have performed as well as I would have hoped. And so when I look at Social Security, I see our most successful social insurance program. That's not actually, I think, even close to in dispute. It has remarkably diminished old age poverty, and it has been durable politically, and it's an essential plank of the social safety net of the United States. But at this point, the outlook for Social Security is that inside of 15 years, in the absence of some change, there will be a 25% across-the-board cut in benefits for people in retirement. That's a big income risk. And so, as Elizabeth said, one of my bones of contention with the state of play is the program intended to alleviate financial risk for old age seniors is now the financial risk for old age seniors. And that's not okay. And it troubles me that that's where we are. And it's a big financial risk. If you want to preserve the benefits, you have to increase the payroll tax by approximately 5 or 6 percentage points, which is doubling the employee share, for example. That's a big deal. And my concern in adding new benefits is, A, the structure, which I'm going to come back to. Or do we really want to adopt the same structure that has led us to this position? And B, is it really true that Americans want to pay for the new benefit and the one that they haven't paid for yet? Because we're not talking about a percentage point. We're talking about 6 for Social Security and then another one for the new benefit. And I'm not sure I am convinced of that at this point. So that's the Social Security story, and that's the best one. Like, that's the one that works the best. Then we have Medicare, which in my view spends a lot of money, and where the gap between premiums and payroll taxes going in and spending going out is $350 billion a year and rising. It is responsible by itself for 1/3 of all federal debt outstanding. And because of those characteristics, not because of any benefits provided, but because of the nature of the financing, it will also have to change and is, again, generating a big financial risk to the seniors it is supposed to insulate from financial risk. Now, you're going to hear people from my side of the aisle say that we can fix all this by just growing faster, not raising taxes or anything. You're going to hear people on the other side saying we can do all this by just raising taxes, not touching the programs. They're both wrong. There's no way we get through this without dealing with the programs and raising taxes. And so the question is going to be, how should these programs be structured so that we don't end up in the same position again? So that's what led me to write the paper, that and the fact that Bell said you have to write the paper. So I wrote the paper. I've learned to listen to Bell. And so I'm not going to pretend that the paper is a sweeping vision for what a new social safety net looks like. It's not. It's where would you end up if you looked at the lay of the land with my kinds of reservations and tried to take out the sort of problems that this payroll tax finance universal program seems to have delivered. And so I backed into the thing that's in the paper almost by sort of worrying out loud and having Ben say, well, maybe we could do this and that. So we ended up with this structure with this first said, okay, let's acknowledge that if you go away from the payroll tax structure with the mandatory benefits, you can do a couple of things. Number one, you can, for those who are capable, and Elizabeth is right with this, not everyone should be saving. You shouldn't take a really poor person and say, save your money. They're poor, they don't have any. So, but for those who can save, they should save against their own future risks. That's beneficial for the economy. Doing all this stuff in a pay-as-you-go fashion has diminished overall national resources in saving. We need to grow more rapidly, so that's a good thing. So, where you can, put that in. So we have accounts into which people can put money against the cost of their future paid leave. For those who need more help to get there, we have additional federal subsidies to that. That's a targeted, not universal benefit. I want to echo what Angela said about the importance of targeting in some of these cases. Before we open it up to everybody, let's create a smaller program and see how it works. In our case, I agree completely with Elizabeth. You cannot make employers vessels of the social safety net. It's not going to work in the 21st century. It's over. So think of a different strategy so that we don't have any employer mandates in this. We want people to get hired and have jobs. That's all important. And we made the program voluntary to begin with to make sure we didn't buy out the base. If there's some stuff out there that's going on, we didn't want to force people into the government program and lose the beneficial stuff. There's a lot of uncertainty about just how much leave is being taken, for what purposes, and how it's financed, and I'm cognizant of that, so we wanted to leave that. But you end up with a hybrid structure. Pure self-insurance says, I save against all my future risks. Pure social insurance says, no, we have a pool of contributions and we just shift back across people, and that's how we mitigate risks for an individual. And this is a hybrid. There's some mitigation through self-insurance, which I think has benefits in the whole, and there's some mitigation because of the targeted income transfers that is really traditional, more traditional kinds of social insurance. I, at least, without endorsing any of the particulars of the benefit structure or anything like that, think that it merits some consideration, because I think to simply repeat another program modeled on Social Security, Medicare, any UI, any of the traditional insurance programs is to put yourself in a position that when those traditional programs have to be paid for, there's no money, or they turn into just as big a problem as those traditional programs. And I don't think that would be wise for the future, and that, in the end, unwise for the people we're trying to help.
That's it.
That's it.
Okay. One quick question
Read the paper. It's awesome.
that I was just thinking about as you were talking. Although you want it voluntary for reasons I understand, would you go for an auto enrollment provision?
Yeah, but you can auto enroll and opt out. I think the behavioral stuff's real.
Yeah.
I don't have a big problem with that.
It's a very interesting hybrid. It's also, though, people on the liberal side say, well, social insurance is working. It's not a heavy lift to add something to it. You've been hearing those arguments all day. And on the other side, I think that the idea of moving to some kind of private accounts could become a slippery slope too, for those who like the idea of social insurance. Once we begin to provide programs through a system of voluntary private accounts, even if there is some federal assistance, then the argument will be, well, maybe Social Security should be done through private accounts. So it's an interesting, to me, parallel here of two different philosophies colliding with each other there, and each side worrying about the slippery slope, if you can put it that way. I think
I want to agree with that. Can I say a couple words about that? Yeah. So number one, on it working, we agree on the benefits. I think Social Security is worth reforming because it's worth preserving, and I don't think it should be in private accounts. I think it's the last real annuity in the economy, and you should hold on to it. But the scale of the problem is 6 percentage points of payroll in Social Security. The Medicare problem is comparable. So now you're at 12. just in terms of magnitudes. I'm not saying it would be payroll tax increases. You could do some through the income tax and make it more progressive, but that's a lot of money. I don't think there's any recognition of the scale of the mismatch between the promises and the financing. And so it's not working. It's not working if the only way you make good on your promises is through magic. That's not a program.
Well, we could argue it's not working for political reasons that we are all well aware of.
I would be nervous about raising taxes by 12 percentage points of payroll as a matter of the economics.
Issue, yeah.
I would. So that's it. Second thing, on the accounts, the downfall of the accounts is exactly as Belle described. They have been oversold on the right, particularly in the Social Security debate. You know, that's another kind of magic. We're going to invest our way out of the problem, which is wrong. But they do have the advantage that in a world of multiple employers and job-to-job mobility, the account travels with the person. And so in thinking about this, there's going to have to be some recognition of that. I think that's a real issue about how the social safety net works going forward. And so it solves that problem.
Relative to employer coverage,
yes. Certainly.
Questions, comments from the audience? Liz.
Hi. Liz Peters from the Urban Institute and American University. So I wanted to ask about kind of the dual purpose of paid family leave, and that is it's a social insurance or an income, an income stabilizer, but it's also facilitating attachment to the workforce, right? And so it's different than other social insurance programs because it has that other component that really has, in some sense, a mandate on the firms to go along with that. I guess my question is, do you want to just have to separate them out so you've got an FMLA kind of thing that's maybe expanded that's not part of social insurance? Or is there some benefit to thinking about those two components together and having employers kind of buy in to the social insurance component and to the attachment to the labor force kind of aspect?
So this may not answer the question, but what I hear you saying is there's a benefit to this policy, attachment to the labor force and continuity of that contact that you need to consider. And I would say yes, you do. There are also costs, and I still came down in the place where I just couldn't really get over the line, like you've heard so many people today. Part of the reason is the family leave aspect is so heterogeneous. We know that some of it is people like my father who had Alzheimer's, and where it's just continuous and long-term, and we don't know how to handle that. We had the Class Act, which was a traditional social insurance program to deal with that, and they could not certify it as financially survivable, and the Congress had to kill it. So I don't really want to launch into that. I want to know more about what we're covering when we get into this.
And I wasn't just thinking about family leave. I was also thinking about parental leave. It's the same kind of principle.
I think the parental leave for me
is only parental leave, right? Your hybrid proposal.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah. So for me, the parental leave for the benefits to the child is the easiest case to make. For me, I'm just speaking for myself. Our entitlement system is all wrong. We have entitled old people and we do nothing for kids. We should entitle all the kids and they'd be able to take care of themselves in old age. And I just can't figure out how to get us from where we are to where we should be. But that's a little step. The parental leave piece I could live with.
Elizabeth, yes, go ahead.
I just want to add, and I don't know if this gets to your point, but I just want to reemphasize a point that's been made a couple times and I think deserves reemphasis, is that I think there are ways that if we expand existing social insurance programs to cover more of the risks, we have the potential to actually cut back on some of the long-term costs as well. So this gets to the SSDI and a bridging point, which I think is really important. And I think we do need more research to know exactly what that's going to look like in terms of dollars. And the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has a project that we've just funded through our competitive grants process that actually is looking at exactly that to try and understand the relationship between TDI and employment outcomes, long-term employment outcomes, earnings outcomes, as well as SSDI enrollment. So that's something that's researchable and I think we'll know more about, but there are good hypothetical reasons and a few studies out there that do suggest that there may be feedback effects within the existing program that, to your point about labor force attachment, that if we expand what we think about social insurance is covering, we may actually be able to sort of control some of the longer term costs. I certainly am not arguing that we're going to solve all of the problems, but I do think that it's not quite as black and white as sometimes we make it out to be, because there are so many interactions that we just don't fully know what they'll look like.
Anybody else? Well, I think, oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. I wanted to ask if you all are familiar with Jody Heyman's research at UCLA to sort of bring to the attention cost estimates around family care specifically. She's done some modeling with public health researchers thinking about like what are the 3 leading causes of death, how much time do families need off for that, and since it's not Alzheimer's or dementia, it's more cardiovascular disease, cancer, so on and so forth. Under her models, 6 months is about the average length of leave necessary, which introduces sort of, I think, like a different dynamic into the conversation about maintaining people in the labor force and not assuming that they're like exiting permanently. So,
and I would just repeat what Angela said, which is where we see in the OECD existence of these policies, it's for terminal care, and that's why.
Well, and I would just add to that, and this is sort of going in the opposite direction of Angela's point. So FMLA leave you can use intermittently, and in many of the states, Vicki, you'll know if it's all of the states, you can use paid caregiving leave intermittently as well. So I would argue even for somebody who has Alzheimer's, or my grandmother who had dementia, and my mother had access to paid leave, and she would take a day, sometimes a couple days a month off, and she could coordinate my grandmother's care, who was still in a long-term care facility. This didn't solve the long-term care issue, and I think it's crazy to suggest that this will solve that, but I do think it has the potential to keep someone like my mother in the labor force who otherwise would have retired early because she wouldn't have been able to actually coordinate my grandmother's care, and I think it also probably led to better care and potentially fewer medical expenses for my grandmother because she was getting the care that she needed. So I think it's again, not quite so black and white, and it's certainly not going to solve every problem in the world. But I do think it has the potential to have some feedback effects that sometimes get lost when we think of, the world is falling, the social assurance system is falling apart, and this certainly isn't going to solve it all, and therefore we can't do anything.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think my one question is whether, what I think would be really interesting to see, and I know this is very difficult to model, is sort of like, what are we already paying in terms of like people exiting the labor market, like health effects of having to balance work and care. These are like costs that we're not counting that clearly have an effect on people's lives and the economy, and maybe that can help us have a little bit more of a realistic conversation about, sure, the $49 billion that we would pay for a paid leave system, but also like what we're saving elsewhere and that sort of thing. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank both Elizabeth and Doug and Aparna and our entire working group for being here today. Actually, the entire group wasn't here, but all of those of you who could come and spoke. And for all of you who attended, thank you so much for taking the time. And if you have thoughts or ideas for us, we will be moving forward, we think and we hope, to do more research especially on medical leave and on caregiving leave. So if you are sitting on a brilliant idea or some wonderful data that speaks to these issues, or you have some other state level experience, we would be delighted to hear from you or from anyone who's working in this area. So thanks again to everyone, and I think we're adjourned.
Thank you.